Welcome to Dispatch Live. It's a special election day, election night edition of Dispatch Live. We're happy, of course, as always, to welcome all of our Dispatch readers to this Dispatch Live. Our weekly live stream is usually a members only offering. But tonight we're offering everyone the chance to follow the election results and take refuge from some of the election night chaos that's out there. Maybe it's already started happening. If you enjoy the show, I think everybody else on this live stream would encourage you to go to thedispatch.com/join and become a Dispatch member. If you do that, you can access all our future members only live streams, as well as all the great articles and newsletters and podcasts that we put out with some of this crew that I've got with me, contributing quite a bit to that. This evening, I've got Steve Hayes, Sarah Isger, and Jonah Goldberg to start us out from the Dispatch, as well as a special guest, Mike Madrid. Mike Madrid joining us. He's a veteran Latino GOP consultant, author of The Latino Century, and co-founder of the Lincoln Project. Steve, Sarah, Jonah, and Mike, welcome to Dispatch Live, Election Edition. How's everyone doing?
Hey, Mike.
Not all
Busy,
at once.
crazy.
Yeah,
It's great to be with you guys. It's like all my heroes all in one place.
All right, Steve, let's go to you first. Just initial reactions. We were a few hours from the first polls closing. Your thoughts on how things look right now, particularly in Georgia and North Carolina, where most of the vote is in?
Yeah, it's still early. None of those states, none of the swing states, battleground states have been called by any of the networks. The numbers are pretty close still at this point. But I think looking at those numbers right now, you'd much rather be Donald Trump than you would Kamala Harris. To the extent that we pay attention to such things, Decision Desk HQ, which does a pretty good job of analyzing and projecting winners, I think last I saw had the likelihood of a Trump victory overall at 71%. I think the New York Times needle has moved into lean territory, and that's largely because Trump is doing well in places like Georgia and North Carolina specifically. He seems to be boosting his vote totals in rural areas above what he had in 2020, not uniformly, but more than not. And where he's bleeding in suburbs, it's more mixed, I think, than the Kamala team would have wanted going in. So starting off looking like a pretty good night for Donald Trump. On the Senate side, it seems like basically what most people expected to happen is happening. Republicans winning in West Virginia, looking at some other pretty good likely pickups for them, with a number of races still too close to call.
All right. Well, actually, Mike, I want to turn to you because I'm always a little nervous to engage too much with the exit polls, but they're there. So why don't we talk about them until the actual results come in? Let's go with these network exit polls. And I want to ask you, because this is an area of your expertise, the Latino vote, the Hispanic vote. If you look at the exit polls, Donald Trump appears to be doing better than just about any Republican presidential candidate. I'm looking at the numbers here. Let's see, 12% of the vote in the exit poll were Hispanic or Latino. Harris is winning 53%, and Donald Trump is winning 45% of that vote. It's so much more lopsided when you consider gender. You've got Latino men, 54%. Trump is actually winning Latino men, and Latino women, he's doing worse. Harris is 61%. Again, these are exit polls. These aren't actual results. What do you make of this breakdown, and what does it tell us about kind of the future of politics in a lot of these key swing states like Arizona and Nevada that have large Hispanic and Latino populations?
So one of the real challenging things about working on the Latino vote for 30 years is exit polls are kind of the only data that you really have because the samples were so small. So the only way to look at apples to apples, like how did Reagan do to Bush to Trump, is to look at exits. The data is getting a little bit better. There are some people that are doing a little bit more refined work that are saying, no, it's mid to high 30s, which is still a very high, historically high range. But yeah, there's somebody who worked on George W. stuff in 2000 and 2004 independently, doing the Latino stuff. These were big numbers, and we never thought that another Republican would get there without the approach that he was taking. But as we're all, keenly aware, the coalitions in both parties are changing, and they're changing dramatically. A large part of that is this diploma divide that we're all keenly aware of. U.S.-born Hispanic men are moving to the right faster than any other demographic in the country. And a large part of that has to do with the fact that they're also the fastest growing segment of the non-college educated blue-collar workforce. And as Latinos move to the explosion in the Latino vote is happening with third and fourth generation U.S.-born Latinos now. So the immigration issues, which have so defined the orthodoxy of the Democratic Party, they've really, frankly, never had the resilience or the stickiness that Democrats thought they had. It really doesn't work now. In fact, it's working in the reverse, kind of saying this is, I think the best way to say it is to look at both of these campaign operations. You had Kamala Harris and Joe Biden's called Latinos Going Biden, Latinos Going Harris, a Spanish language appeal. Spanish language is the fastest shrinking part of the Latino electorate. Trump goes with Latinos and adds Americans, Latino Americans for Trump. At 2/3 of these third and fourth generation Latinos identify as typically American. Smart tactical move. They're speaking to two different subsets of the Latino vote. Trump speaking really directly to this rapidly growing audience under 30. Keep in mind, almost 40% of the Latino vote is under the age of 30 years old. Yeah. And we just surpassed the black vote in 2020 as the largest ethnic minority. So we're about to just hit exponential growth rates. And the Trump people, to their credit, were speaking right to that demographic. And the Democrats are speaking not just to the fastest shrinking demographic. I think they were repelling the other fast growing group. And you throw in some good old fashioned economic populism on that. And this is what you get. This is what happened. I wrote a book on it in June saying this is going to happen. And here it happens. And, anybody
Mike,
who's been watching isn't terribly surprised.
Yeah, there's an irony to this, because if you listen to a lot of the Trump rhetoric and the Trump campaign rhetoric about immigration, particularly in this cycle, there's been a real uptick in the kind of talk that the Biden-Harris administration is trying to import new Democratic voters. Now, there's a sort of a long tail here, but it seems that generations go by. You talked about American-born Latino voters. They're turning Republican. They're not turning Democratic voters. That just seems like a sort of a remarkable irony when it comes to the rhetoric of the Trump campaign and the way voters in that demographic group are moving.
Maybe. Yeah. I mean, I've seen some of that. Some of this is a typical assimilative pattern that we've seen with, Irish and Italians and Greeks and Poles and other groups at the turn of the last century.
Yeah.
You're definitely making a very good case about the kind of the vulgarity and the crassness of it all. But when you identify as overwhelmingly typically American, they don't see this as talking to them. And like literally every time I write about Latino issues on social media, it's always, I hope people, hope you realize you're going to be deported. It's like, my family's been here 100 years. Like
right.
I mean, if I'm going, then we're all going. Like, you know what I mean? At that point, it's, and maybe maybe that's the argument, the case that they're making. But what I'm saying is, in the political vernacular, Latino voters, this rapidly growing third, fourth. When I was a kid studying this stuff at Georgetown 25 years ago, there was no fourth generation. All we had were bad exit polls. Now there's a discernible fourth generation that you can actually study and see their politicization. And the difference between a third generation Latino and a recently migrated Latino naturalized US, citizen is tectonic. Like there's just two completely different universes. And there's just this need, and I think it's part of this kind of racial ethnic headlock that Democrats have put themselves in to say, if you're not white, there's got to be a racial lens through which you view the world. And that, again, was the thesis of my book, which is you guys are missing the whole thing. The Republicans do it too. I mean, one of the great ironies is the 2012 autopsy was predicated on that same belief.
Right.
Is we need to diversify the party, and the way we do that is through immigration reform. And I was saying that's not right. Like that's not the way this works. But of course, parties are going to do what they do. The narrative was set, and what they realized was, then it was Donald Trump. Remember, that's the whole story. Donald Trump was part of the backlash to the 2012 autopsy. Ironically, the Republican Party is more ethnically and racially diverse now than it was since any time since before the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Like this is a more diverse party under Donald Trump because he's not speaking to them in racial or ethnic terms. And incidentally, and I'll sorry to keep going on, but the other fascinating thing about this is our whole conceptualization, our whole understanding of what a minority voter is just changed after this election. It's not the same thing. You can't impart that non-white people are all going to vote based off of racial or ethnic grievance issues.
I mean, Mike, isn't, just to chime in here for a second, isn't part of the problem even with the term Latino?
Yeah.
Right. Because like the similarities between, say, Mexicans and Cubans and Colombians and Venezuelans, particularly who come in at different times, right? They're big cultural differences. It's sort of like talking about the European vote, right? I mean, I mean, there's a commonality there, but also there's a lot of differences. And I remember Sean Trendy making the point 15 years ago now that the reason why Hispanics disproportionately voted Democratic, and back then when we talked about Hispanics or Latinos, we were basically talking about Mexican Americans,
right?
Was that they were disproportionately poor, and poor people vote Democratic, and as they move up the socioeconomic socioeconomic ladder, I remember his phrase for it was they become indistinguishable from the median voter.
That's what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing.
And so, like, all you have to do is if you just pick. If it's a monolith that actually isn't a monolith, it's very easy to split it take a bite a third off, and you undermine the whole concept.
Yeah, and look, there's a demographic argument for this. I mean, and again, without getting too deep in the weeds, is immigration levels really slowed after 2007 up until 2021 when Biden took office. There's a dramatic pause, there's a dramatic lull, and what happened was the Latino voter, as it stands, and you make a very good point, we should explore that a little bit, but the Latino voter became, what happened was during that pause was U.S.-born births started to explode when the naturalized immigrants started to drop, which is why Spanish is dropping. Univision is in trouble. Telemundo is in trouble. Their viewership is collapsing, and this explosion of the U.S.-born vote is assimilating, essentially. Now, there are some differences. It's not exactly comparable to other immigrant groups in the past. One is the size and the scope. And we are going to, like I said, we become a non-white majority country. We're becoming a multiracial country. And that's going to change our conceptual. We've always been a black and white country, at least in our vernacular, right? In our language. That's the way we viewed it, and for good reason. But that doesn't fit anymore, especially when Latinos aren't motivated by racial or ethnic issues. This is an economic pocketbook issue. It's a economic populist voter, and that's the way they're voting. And like I said, I think it still shocks elites that this is possible because it's against the whole American conceptualization of race. Look, something you're going to hear a lot in the next 10 years, I'm predicting, is people are going to start saying whites are not monolithic. We're not all the same, right? As whites shrink as a share of the votes, and be like, well, we're not all the same. And white, in many ways, not entirely, not cleanly, but is an American construct. You go to Europe, and they're British, they're French, they're Italian, they're German. They don't say I'm white, right? There is a nationality there. There is an ethnicity there, and that's kind of this goes back to Roosevelt and the melting pot and the progressive era and the need to drop the hyphen to become fully American and nation building. But what's happening is we are becoming less white, of less European descendancy. All of this is scrambled. And this old notion of a black-white minority racially polarized voter, I think, goes out the window tonight. I think that's one of the It won't be the immediate narrative because I think a lot of shocking things are happening tonight, but that's one of the things that we'll discuss in the coming weeks and months, is saying, wait a second, something happened here. This racial realignment maybe wasn't a realignment at all. Maybe it's something that's more typical of the American experience than not.
Hey, Mike, before you go, can I just jump in and ask one quick question? What are those shocking things that you see happening right now beyond what you've been discussing?
Yeah, well, I mean, broadly, look, I mean, I thought the margins, I never thought the Sulzer poll was accurate, but I did think that there was going to be a bigger break amongst white, older women than I think we are seeing right now. And I think one of the things that that's going to test the theory of the case here, I think that would be very interesting, is what we're seeing with these margins, which I think were just correctly described, you just described absolutely correctly, is will that hold in the Rust Belt states? Will the North actually will white women in the North break more towards Harris than they did in the Sun Belt states?
Right.
I think that's the first thing that will determine the outcome of the election, is can this blue wall hold for the Democrats? The second is, if Harris does lose North Carolina and Georgia and Arizona and Nevada, but wins the blue wall, we don't have, it will be because she lost the Latino working class, but did well with the white working class. Right. Boy, that's a conundrum for the Democrats who are losing working class voters broadly, right? Suddenly, in 2016, there was this criticism of Trump that he was trying to increase the white vote. Well, Kamala Harris now needs to increase the white vote. Donald Trump needs to increase the black and the brown vote. That's what he's doing. That's why he's as competitive as he is. So that's what I'm saying, is like the intersection of race, class, and partisanship has been turned on its head. And I don't think we've given that as much appreciation as we should, and hopefully will, because the parties are just not what they were anymore. And you guys know that as well as anybody, right? It's just not. And so what does that mean when the right-left spectrum has been tilted on its head, and it's now kind of this top-down spectrum? How does the conceptualization of race change, the working class change? Latino working class voters are voting differently than white working class voters, in many ways more conservatively, or at least more Republican, more Trumpy than white working class voters. I mean, for people like us, it's going to get very we're going to be busy sifting through a lot of this stuff, trying to discern what it all means. For sure. In a great way.
Well, Mike, we'd love to talk about that more. I know you've got to get going, but would love to have you back, maybe on a Dispatch podcast, to talk about this more once all of these results shake out. Mike Madrid, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for
Thanks. Sarah, let's go to you here. We just talked about this one segment of what we're seeing, a sort of a stronger Trump performance. So, we're bringing in Megan McArdle here as well, who's joining us. Hi, Megan. There she is.
Hi.
All right, Megan, Sarah, you have a little thing in there. All right, and I'm going back
traveling pants over with, and let's.
And Megan, feel free to jump in here too. But Sarah, I'm just curious. We're seeing that change among the Republican coalition with Hispanic Latino voters. What are you seeing big picture so far in these results that tells you something about the new Trump and the new Republican coalition?
Yeah, I mean, the two campaigns had very different theories of the electorate. You had Donald Trump saying that this electorate was going to be controlled by low propensity, blue collar, non-college educated, predominantly male voters. And you had the Harris campaign saying, we're going to win the suburbs. They weren't just yin and yang and about voter turnout. They were different theories of the electorate. And I think what we're seeing so far is evidence for Trump's theory. And we're just not yet seeing a lot of evidence for Harris's theory. I don't think we've seen proof that her theory is wrong yet. But that's where, Steve, I really agree with you. You'd rather be Trump than Harris, because we are seeing evidence that his theory is right. And because they're not simply inverse versions of each other, we still have many more hours ahead of us. I also fear that at this point, the best case path for Harris is the worst one really for the country, which is Trump wins North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, just like Mike said, and then she wins the blue wall, which would have her winning by 2 electoral college votes. And unlike 2020, where Trump would have had to flip 2 states to win the presidency, win 2 challenges, he'd only need to win 1 here. And if Wisconsin stays as tight as it looks, et cetera, that could be bad.
Yeah, bad in the sense of talk about an outcome that where the country, so divided right now, gets through the election, and it feels just as divided as before. Kevin Williamson, thank you also as well for joining us.
No one blew any kisses at me when I showed up. Thank you.
In my mind, I did, Kevin.
In my heart.
And that's where that should stay.
Exactly. Megan, let's bring you in here. Your first thoughts seeing this, strong performance, kind of predicted by the polls, I should say, for Trump in Georgia and North Carolina. It's not that divergent from
not that shocking.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts about where things go? Do you concur that this could come down to just the blue wall or bust?
It could come down to the blue wall, but as I believe a clever person named Sarah Isger said on Twitter, her theory of the electorate is getting harder and harder to believe in. It's not impossible, but things are not looking good. She underperformed in Lackawanna County. Looks like she underperformed in Nash County, North Carolina, Baldwin County, Georgia. These were places that you wanted to look at because they had a good demographic mix, and Trump is doing better than he did in 2020 in all of them. So while, it's the fat lady has not sung, I will be doing that later, but it's just, I think it is weirdly, as someone just said again on Twitter, I spend too much time on that site. It is somehow in line with the polls, and also everyone's pre-writes are getting shredded right now. I've texted my editor 5 different column ideas already, as the night has progressed. So I think where I am right now is the one thing, what do we really know? People hate inflation. They really, really hate inflation. And I do not think that if Trump wins, he can claim a huge mandate for MAGA, but he can certainly claim a huge mandate for do not have high single digit inflation.
Well, but Megan, let me stop you there, because you said he cannot claim, if it goes this way, a huge mandate for MAGA, but he could, that's possible.
No.
That he could say
he will. He physically, the words will come past his lips at some point. But I think realistically, what this is showing is I think there really are demographic movements in the electorate, which I actually think are net good, right? It is a good sign when your racial identity is not the most salient thing when you go to the polls. But also, I think that mostly what we're seeing here is the economy, and to a lesser extent the border, but really the economy.
Kevin,
the irony, of course, is that Trump will press for enormously inflationary policies.
Oh, indeed. And raise and slap on tariffs that will raise prices. Right. I'm not saying that if I was personally, my number one issue is inflation, I would have chosen Donald Trump. I would not, see tariffs. But I think that most voters do not dive deep into the policy weeds, read Scott Lincecum at Cato. They look at 4 years ago and they're inflation was not bad then. And then Joe Biden got elected and it was. And
part of Harris's problem with her theory of the electorate really focusing on those suburban, women, but really college-educated, wealthier group that had been Republican and trying to move them over. It's the worst possible moment to do that. I think her theory of the electorate could have worked quite well in 2020, for instance. But because of the economy, guess what suburban voters care the most about? And so their theory might not have been wrong, but the economy is just going to swamp it for those voters in particular.
Well, and here's another thing is that she did not do a good job of explaining what she was going to do about the economy. when she was asked specific questions on things other than like, I'm going to make Medicare cover home health care. And as someone who has just been through the home health care nightmare with my father, I understand why they thought that was a good issue. But that said, like, if you asked her deeper questions, she would just go into these reveries about how she grew up middle class. And it's like, many of us grew up middle class, and that is not going to help fix the economy. What are you actually going to do? And she didn't have good answers for any of that stuff.
That was, by the way, a laugh line in JD Vance's stump speech. By the end, he would literally go through. She would be asked, "What will you do really to help the economy and stop inflation?" And he would say, and she'll say, "I grew up middle class," and like everybody would crack up at that line. It's like it was such a part of her identity, I guess, as a candidate, that she just kind of spouted that without any substance underneath. Kevin, you're in Georgia right now. Georgia looks like it's I'm not totally updated. Has it been called by any of the networks yet? I don't
You've got
think
a
so.
whole group of minions behind you. Just yell at them.
Oh, I should do that. I'll just bang on the door. They know how many bangs means tell me what's going on in Georgia.
Georgia versus Wisconsin, yeah.
Exactly. It's Morse code. But it looks like it's going to Trump. Everybody feels like Harris just can't make it up enough. What's your read? You're in Georgia right now. What's your read on my home state and why it's gone back to Trump and back to the Republicans?
Yeah, I think some of this is maybe Roy Teixeira's revenge, in the sense that you've got Democrats who read half of his book, and they forgot about the part where you have to keep the working class voters who are part of the New Deal coalition to make that all work with their new numbers of a more diverse, more Black, younger, more immigrant voting population. So it's kind of interesting if you look at like these rural far north counties in Georgia, and Trump won these by like 80% the last time around, but now he's winning them by 86%. And so these kind of economically struggling rural areas are turning out in the kinds of numbers for Trump that you saw with African American voters turning out for Barack Obama. So there seems to be a real kind of sense of, I think, identification there. Anytime you're doing 86% in a place, that's a huge number, and it doesn't look, at least around here, like Harris's advantage in the suburbs is going to be enough to offset that, even though some enormous share of the population lives in a couple of urban counties and suburban counties in Georgia, in the same way that pretty much the whole population of Nevada lives in 2 metro areas. And Pennsylvania's not quite that lopsided, but there's just not enough juice there to make that work. And I kind of suspect that once we do get the information, one of the things that might be holding back Harris's advantage in the suburbs is that she's doing really, really well with suburban women, but not as strongly with suburban men. And because a lot of these blue blazer Republican types who are getting very, very drunk outside right now and quoting Sun Tzu to each other and that sort of thing are suburban guys. They're guys who own businesses in the suburbs and live in the suburbs, and they're pretty hardcore Trumpists. So there are more people in the suburbs than kind of liberal educated professionals, and the Democrats don't seem to be doing super well with them. The Republicans were super confident here just from early in the day. The first Republican campaign person I talked to was around maybe 2:00, and they weren't being cocky about it, but they were like, "Yeah, we think we've probably got this one. We're not too worried about it."
Yeah, I'd been hearing something between a 1 point Harris win to a 2.5 point Trump win in Georgia, and then earlier tonight before the polls closed, that person told me, 1 or 2 points for Trump. That seems to be what it's likely to be. What do we think about this this sort of mixed bag in the suburbs, guys? There is some indication that Harris is gaining on Biden in some suburbs and others not so much. I think inflation is probably a big part of that. And a lot of it may be also just that, Democrats have essentially won 3 national elections in a row. 2022, I kind of consider a Democratic win because everyone thought it was going to be such a big Republican win in those midterms, and it really wasn't.
If I could jump in with just one thing real quick before everyone else runs into that. We oversimplified the suburban vote. You know, we talk about the collar counties around Philadelphia, and I lived in Bucks County. I lived in Montgomery County. They are nothing like the Harris County suburbs of Houston. They're culturally different. They're politically different. The idea that there's sort of a, generic suburban outlook or voter or way of life is an oversimplification that we're going to have to deal with at some point.
Can we call it the macaroni grill vote?
You can.
Better than soccer moms. I also think, one thing that, looking at this, the dog that has not barked in this election is abortion. Trump is running well ahead of the pro-life vote on abortion initiatives. And I think that tells you, so my argument for overturning Roe was always like, this should be done at the states. People should be voting for local laws that are what they want. And I think that is what is happening. And so this issue is decoupling from it looks to me, early days yet, et cetera, as if this issue is decoupling from the national vote. And so, in 2020,
there was the theory in Arizona, by the way, Megan, that in fact, it freed up voters to vote for Republicans on the ticket if they could also vote on abortion ballot measures, so they could sort of have their cake and eat it too. And in Florida, for instance, that's of course exactly what we saw, 57% voting yes on the Florida measure that lost because they have a 60% threshold. But that's still a huge number of voters who voted for Trump and the Florida more pro-choice ballot measure.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, is that this issue is now becoming separated from national politics. And that's, I think, a really good thing, regardless of what you think about abortion. It is good that it is not like this massive issue that is poisoning our politics and driving Supreme Court appointments and all the rest of it. It is good that is not happening as much as it would have 2 or 4 or 8 years ago. So I think that's a sign of progress. It has taken a while to get there. I think it was a big issue in 2022. But that's also something I think that's really bad for Kamala Harris's theory of the electorate.
Yeah, we heard so much about the Trump abortion bans,
yep,
in states across the country. And whenever I was sitting in the back of a Democratic rally, I always think, well, Trump's not governor. Trump's not, in the state legislatures in these places. And sounds like maybe voters were able to make that distinction. Let's stick on sort of something I wanted to bring up with Mike Madrid, but we didn't have time. There was this talk just last week or whenever this Madison Square Garden rally was, that the joke from the comedian Tony Hinchcliffe that called Puerto Rico trash was going to be this sort of thing that turned the election and turned Hispanic voters away from Trump. Doesn't appear to have happened. Maybe we'll see some places on the margins where it worked. Do you guys have any, are these kind of things, these moments that happen right before the election because everybody's paying attention to them, do we sort of over index for how important they are and forget, I'm guilty of it, forget about the fundamentals of the race?
So I have a different theory on this. I think that, we all remember, we've talked about this a million times, that in 2016, we would always talk about how the laws of political gravity will eventually claim Donald Trump and he'll come back down to earth. And it turned out, Kevin and I write about this all the time, is that he's not subject to the laws of political gravity. He's subject to the laws of celebrity gravity. And that's like quantum realm different stuff, right? And I think there's a similar thing with the comedian. Donald Trump is in many ways a shock comedian. And the things he says, one of the reasons when people ask me, is there any hope for the GOP and the conservative movement? And they always are shocked to find out that I sound more optimistic or hopeful than you would think, given, my dyspepsia normally. And it's because most Trump imitators cannot get elected. And it's because he is just judged differently. And anyone who behaves like the kind of jerk that Trump does tends to lose. and none of even the vast majority of prominent major pro-Trump Republicans will not talk like him because it doesn't work for them. They cannot pull it off. It's sort of like Sarah's favorite skit from Saturday Night Live where Tom Brady can sexually harass anybody he wants, but but the dorky guy can't even ask someone out on a date, right? Trump can get away with this stuff, and I think there's a transitive property to that, to the whole Madison Square Garden thing. If that had been a Mitt binders full of women Romney, it would have been the end of Trump's campaign, and it would have been all over. But it's just different, and I think that's priced in, even with a lot of Puerto Ricans who were pissed off about it. I do think it probably had some effect, but there were a whole bunch of Democratic activists, and we should have talked to Mike Madrid about this, but there were a whole bunch of Democratic activists, whether it's on Hispanic stuff or Black stuff and all these kinds of things. Their job is to find reasons to be offended and hold it against Republicans. And the reason why they're successful at it is it's worked for 40 years. It doesn't work against Trump, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of Republicans forgive him for it, and it's one of the reasons why he makes a lot of Democrats crazy.
I started laughing inappropriately on ABC a couple weeks ago, I guess a week and a half ago, after Trump made the Arnold Palmer, it's not a joke really, reference story.
Observation.
This, and for those who don't know, it was...
Explain it, Sarah. Explain it. Yes.
I would love to.
You
Megan,
brought it
this
up.
is for you. But the idea was, right, that people would look at Arnold Palmer in the shower and be like, wow, okay. So this Democratic strategist came on and was like, it was so inappropriate and outrageous. And ABC, was like, it was a lewd story. Let us play it for you. And then they played the whole clip. And there was just no mention of the fact that Obama, of course, just recently had talked about Trump's maleness and size, and no Democrat was wringing their hands about that. So Jonah, to your point, it's not only, it just comes off as so hollow at this point when both sides have such a similar message on some of this stuff, for then Democrats to try to run their playbook of how could you possibly tell a story from 70 years ago? I don't know when Arnold Palmer was alive, you guys, but I think he's definitely dead now.
He just died a few years ago.
Whatever. Ancient. And it wasn't even it was so not lewd that you could show it over and over again on TV.
Yeah.
Also, immigrant communities from relatively poor backgrounds sometimes tend to be politically serious and to not be as easily stampeded by something like a stupid, ugly, tasteless joke as, kind of wealthier, more sensitive communities are. If you look at, the political rhetoric of the early 20th century, late 19th century, Irish Americans weren't getting too upset about Irish jokes.
No, I think that's fair. Okay, let's talk maybe a little more about the women vote, because I think to go to Sarah's point about the Harris campaign's theory of the race, a big part of this was convincing some number. Was it 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7% of potential Republican women who were repulsed by Trump or repulsed by Trump's, actions on January 6th, whatever it was, using Liz Cheney as a sort of, as an olive branch to those Republicans. It's okay to vote for a Democrat like Kamala Harris. We have to wait and see the results, particularly in some of these, in the blue wall states where they really ran hard. The Harris campaign did with this strategy. But any kind of initial thoughts as we wait for these results to come in on the efficacy of that strategy now that we're seeing some of the vote come in?
I'll just say that I didn't think it was a great sign for what their internal numbers were showing when we started having to see the ads on secret Harris voters, right? This idea that the women could just keep it a secret. You don't have to tell anyone, because that means they weren't seeing the women move not secretly in the numbers. And so then they were going to hope for, a shy Harris voter the same way that you had perhaps seen shy Trump voters in 2016. there is still a possibility that those voters exist. We certainly talked on our Slack channel, though, about like, would you lie to your spouse about who you voted for? Would it give you pause if your spouse were voting for someone differently than you were? Things like that. Again, it's just a bit of a harder uphill climb, and exit polling, right? What are you going to do? Can't live with it, can't live without it. But right now it shows that, again, Trump's theory of the electorate proved correct, that he did move men compared to 2020, but that she didn't really move women compared to Biden. Now, that still leaves a huge gender gap. Don't get me wrong. Biden won women by 11 points. I think this had Harris winning women by 12 points. But whereas Biden only lost men by 2 points, Trump was winning, I think, men by 9 points or something like that.
Steve, you wrote about the January 6th issue over at the Dispatch, and whether it would be playing a big role in convincing, again, Republican voters, a lot of them women, but a lot of them not, to support Harris this time around. Is the obsession with January 6th, which I think we all share, we all remember it, we have been writing about it and covering the sort of fallout since. Is it maybe an elite phenomenon that things like inflation, economic concerns, and time have just kind of washed away for the rest of voters? What say you now while we're still waiting for results?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And look, I mean, that was true to a certain extent, both in the polling that we were seeing in the last several months, but also in interviews that I did with voters in Wisconsin and elsewhere. People would say, yeah, well, I was concerned about January 6th when it happened. It bothered me. I don't think Trump should have done it. But ultimately, we had this transfer of power. It wasn't exactly peaceful. Maybe we'd call it a bumpy transfer of power. But power was transferred. Joe Biden was president. And then we got this crazy inflation. And my ground beef is still 40% more than it was when Joe Biden was elected. And that's what I'm most concerned about. So take all of your theoretical concerns about democracy and put them well behind my concerns about inflation and things like that. But the other thing I think that is really interesting, and it's one of the things that we're starting to see emerge from these exit polls, both on the national level and on the state by state level, particularly in the upper Midwest, the democracy is threatened issue, which I think it's broader than January 6th, but certainly includes January 6th. And this was obviously a key argument that the Harris campaign has been making intensely. They, had Liz Cheney participate in several of these events to sort of raise those issues and make the arguments. And if you look at the exit polling on these questions, it's mixed. And in some cases, it's Trump voters who thought that democracy was more threatened than Harris voters, despite all of the time that she spent saying democracy is on the ballot. Donald Trump is a fascist. He's a threat. If you just look at Pennsylvania, you ask voters percentage-wise, how many, or percentage-wise, the voters that said we were basically secure in our democracy versus our democracy being threatened, 24% said secure, 74% said threatened. But the difference there is, among those 74% who said democracy is threatened, 53% of those people voted for Donald Trump. 46% of them voted for Kamala Harris. And you can see these kinds of breakdowns in Wisconsin and also at the national level. So that issue, which I think is a big issue, I mean, I'm clearly out of touch. Like, this is me being an elitist journalist. I care a lot about democracy, care a lot about January 6th. I think it's a problem that he lied to try to steal the election and then used violence to remain in power. Apparently, that's not as big an issue as for many people as it is to me, as I think it should be.
She still has a path, by the way. We're acting like this thing got called. There's a path.
There's a path. No, there's a path. The blue wall is still competitive. It's just, to go back to the question about women voters, I think we'd have to see women voters and suburban voters behave differently in these blue wall states than it looks like they behaved in these in Georgia and North Carolina. Is that right, Sarah?
Yeah. Oh, Megan, you're muted.
That's not impossible. Sean Trent has pointed out that in 2022, the blue wall states did not move with other states.
Right.
So, it is really possible that it's just going to be like the South is reddening up and weirdly Manhattan. But that
and Virginia.
Yeah. Well, Virginia, I think of as still technically being south of the Mason-Dixon line.
Loudoun County ain't. I mean, it literally is. I know that. I just mean,
Yes.
Culturally speaking.
yeah.
Well, yes, not. But they might just move differently. It's a different group of people with a special group of problems. My mom's from Western New York, which is like basically northern Pennsylvania, and it's a different place from the rest of the country.
And even North Carolina and Georgia, they could shift enough that she could win them very, very narrowly at this point. And obviously, we just don't have enough in Arizona. Like, the point is, she could still win every state. It's just getting harder and harder to get there.
Right.
You sound like you're trying to talk some listeners off a ledge, Sarah.
They might be in my own house. Who knows?
You'll have no optimism here.
All right, Kevin. Speaking of optimism, before we let you go, I would give us some optimism that you're so well known for, because you'll be back later in the show. But any sort of final thoughts in this early part of the discussion as the results are coming in?
Americans are basically unserious people who can't be trusted to govern themselves anymore. No,
That was the optimism we were looking for.
I believe a little bit of that.
Pick me up.
The issues with Trump are from my point of view, should be just so obviously disqualifying that we shouldn't even have the guy in a general election. Of course, I think that the big loser of this election will be Mitch McConnell, of course, who could have prevented all this from happening some years ago if he had had the gumption to take a little bit of more of a risk than he's used to doing in life, and see to it that Trump was convicted and disqualified from seeking further office. But he didn't do that, and I think that will go down as probably his greatest political regret. And if it doesn't, it should.
All right. Well, for that, pick me. Go, Becky. Go ahead.
I think the danger is right. This is gonna to Republicans who just care about winning. This is gonna they're gonna thank Mitch McConnell because could another Republican have done this? And I think actually the answer is yes. Yes, a Republican, like a squirrel in a suit that was on the GOP ticket, could have beaten this, not because Kamala Harris is the worst candidate ever, although I think she is a very bad candidate, something I've been saying for years. But just because, to go back to my constant refrain, people really hate inflation. And, a lot of it was actually weird. Ironically, a lot of that inflation was seeded by stuff that happened under Trump. But there's no prize for second place. Everyone gets to take credit for the good stuff that happens on their watch, even if they didn't cause it. And they also get hit for anything bad that happens, again, even if they didn't cause it. Just ask George Bush, who got fairly hit for the Iraq War and unfairly hit for Katrina and for the global financial crisis, which he didn't really have anything to do with. And that's just the rules of the game.
So,
well, Kamala Harris was going to have a problem separating herself from Joe Biden anyway, right? But she missed every opportunity to do that. Every single one. Every time she was asked, she botched it the first time and said, I can't really think of anything. And then she was asked again. She was given do-overs, and she still couldn't do it. If Joe Biden, now you're right, it's not done. People are still voting. The blue wall is still theoretically intact. The New York Times, I think, has the Trump likelihood up to 86% of a Trump victory. So we're getting close. The other person, I think, to add to Kevin's point, beyond Mitch McConnell, is going to be Joe Biden. And Joe Biden stayed in this race longer than he ought to have, because he was on an ego trip, or he was incapable of actually making the decision to get out. But he had a legacy of getting the country to move on from Donald Trump in 2020. And I think he will now add to that legacy and will greatly overshadow his previous legacy, re-ushering in a new Trump era, if that's in fact what happens.
Yeah. Joe Biden's role in 2020 was to get rid of Donald Trump. And if Donald Trump wins, he failed in that. Kevin, we're going to see you later in the program. I actually want to we're going to talk about a state that they're counting the votes in right now. This is Jason Rowe. Hi, Jason. Welcome aboard. You're the former executive director of the Michigan Republican Party. You're the political strategist, founder of Rowe Strategic Campaigns. Thanks for joining us. And guys, I want us to ask Jason all of the questions we have about Michigan, because I'm looking at Michigan. New York Times says about 27% of the vote is in. The Times' little needle says it leans R. There's a lot of vote left, but how are things looking, Jason? And then I want everybody else to pepper him with questions about the Wolverine state.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for the invitation. Big fans of you guys, so appreciate being with you tonight. I can't think of an election that I've more looked forward to getting into the granular precinct level results post-election than this one, particularly as it relates to Michigan, because I think of all the battlegrounds, Michigan is the most interesting because of the coalitions that make up the two parties here and some of those realignments. And specifically, when you look at the Arab Muslim vote and what that means to Michigan, particularly in a very narrow election, the black vote in Detroit in particular, as well as Flint, Saginaw, Lansing, Grand Rapids, and then the Gen Z vote on the college campuses, which clearly the Harris campaign was trying to juice that up by going to Michigan State on Sunday night and University of Michigan a week before. And I found kind of interesting when you look at the close, especially in Michigan, it seemed to me that the Harris campaign was trying to juice up the base's turnout, whereas Trump seemed to be trying to expand the base for his turnout, particularly when you look at the Arab community and the drop-in Dearborn. Right now, just since I logged in and have been listening to you guys finish the previous conversation, I was looking at the Michigan map, and Harris was leading in Macomb County, home of the famous Reagan Democrats. And just in the few moments that you were finishing up your conversation, I have a feeling that my client running in Michigan 7 was just announced the winner here. I'm at the American Legion Hall in Howell, Michigan, tucked between Detroit and Lansing in Michigan's 7th district. But to me, finishing up on Macomb, just as we were talking, Trump took a lead. And that's, to me, Macomb's one of the more interesting counties. And I would say Kent County is a very interesting county. Like I said, Macomb is home of the Reagan Democrats, a very populist kind of working class electorate that has looked really red and past its look blue, but it is very, very purple. And I have been telling people through the day, we're going to find out what Macomb County really is today, because it also has a very complicated history as it relates to race relations. Macomb County has not, particularly back in the 60s and the 70s, been a very hospitable place for Black Americans. And though John James is the congressman there, he very much underperformed when he ran in 2022. And then in Kent County, which was a bastion of the Republican Party for decades, I mean, the home of Gerald Ford. We've had a lot of Republican leaders in the country as well as the state that come out of Kent County, which has trended very much purple to blue. Peter Meyer lost the seat. Hillary Scholten holds the main Kent County seat now. But you've got a huge Dutch population. And the Dutch are kind of like Mormons. They're very conservative, but they're very polite. And the vulgarity of Donald Trump just doesn't wear well with them. And so I had a CNN reporter call me about a month ago asking, when there's so many Republicans in Kent County, why did Trump underperform? And I said, that's where the Dutch people live. And, this reporter didn't really understand Dutch culture. So those are the two counties that I think are most interesting. But I've always felt, even though Michigan seemed to be in the last couple of weeks on the battleground list, the least likely for Trump to win, I haven't felt that way because of those coalitions. When you look at the Arab Muslim vote, primarily in Dearborn and Wayne County, there's about 350,000 Arab Muslims in the state, and about 100,000 of them voted in the 2020 presidential race. And this is back of the envelope estimates of, the performance. I'd say probably 70-30 for Biden in 2020. Before 9/11, Republicans did pretty well with Muslims, mostly on cultural issues. But after 9/11, the view of the Bush administration and Republicans in Congress targeting the Muslim community, we started to fare very poorly with Muslim voters. We started to inch back over cultural issues, over gender theory and things that were happening in schools and abortion, the Prop 3 ballot initiative. So we started to inch our way back. And then October 7th happened. And we're not exactly a warm pool to jump in if you're a Muslim, being a Zionist party as we are. But I just think that the Biden administration and the way they handled it, messaged it, and the way Kamala Harris has tried to navigate that community has backfired. The publisher of the Arab American News, who I would consider one of the most influential leaders in the Arab community in Michigan, a couple of weeks ago, basically said they both suck. No one, we don't like either one of them. In that vacuum, I don't feel like the Harris campaign tried to take advantage of the situation, and the Trump campaign did. Sometimes clumsily, but they did. They were going in and they were talking to him. And I mean, I thought the drop in Dearborn on Friday for Trump was a very smart move. It was symbolic, but I think it demonstrated to that community that he's paying attention to them and he cares about them, and they're mad at Kamala.
And he had his, I have to say, Jason, just to jump in, and Mike, if you need to step away for a second, feel free to go ahead. But Jason, just to jump in on that point specifically, it wasn't just the drop in Dearborn. You've seen a sort of a steady stream of Trump surrogates in the sort of heavily Arab American suburbs, going to meetings, making the case, often on a sort of a small party basis, to 50 people, to 100 people, not in front of rally crowds, not in front of big, but going there and sort of making the argument. Does that end up mattering? I mean, is that part of the reason that we're looking at this? And was the Harris campaign, to your understanding, doing the same thing, or was she just trying to avoid the issue kind of altogether?
My impression is that she was avoiding it and trying to dance around it. I do think all those things mattered. I was talking to a Detroit News reporter the other day that didn't think some of these things mattered. And I said, well, I think you're misreading the community a little bit, because some of it is just showing the respect to the community that you're making this effort. And I don't think they saw the Harris campaign making a similar effort. And then I also think there's a little bit of Arab culture that feeds into this, and Trump is the strong man. During the Iraq War, I spent about a month in Iraq after the fall of the regime, cataloging the emerging political parties in the country. And I was working with a lot of pro-democracy, pro-West Iraqis. And they'd say, we didn't like Saddam, but we needed Saddam. And I was kind of perplexed by this, given their pro-democracy, pro-West. And they're like, listen, we're kind of an ungovernable people, and we need a strong man to knock our heads together so that we can function. And I think as ham-handed as Trump is in his foreign policy postures, I think they saw in him, maybe not a guy who was directly their advocate, but a guy who they believed was the kind of strong man that could force peace in the region. And so I think part of that was the cultural, but I do think that just the show of respect that he kept coming back, kept sending surrogates, kept competing for this vote, where Harris was, I think, trying to avoid being dragged into having to take any strong positions as it related to which side you were going to be on in that. And so even though it's hard to look at Trump and say he's anything other than a Zionist, I mean, this is the guy that, moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He has been pretty unflinching in his support of Netanyahu. I just think that they believe that he is more committed to a solution than they think that Biden, and by extension Harris, is. And then you look at the black vote, and I can tell you both empirically and anecdotally, I grew up in the south side of Lansing, a majority black community, and in the race for the 7th congressional district, got kind of reunited with some of the people that I grew up with, who are now fairly influential in the black community in Lansing, which is the heart of the 7th district. And, one person in particular, I won't name him, but the last time I had heard his name, he was in prison for selling crack cocaine in the 90s. And it was a 12-year federal sentence. And I come to find out he's now a very influential pastor. And so I reconnected with him. And he didn't even know why I was reconnecting him. Within 1 minute, he told me he was a Republican and he's a Trump supporter. And there's about, by his estimation, about 30 pastors, black pastors in Lansing. And he said the majority of them are Republicans. And I was kind of dumbfounded by this. And then I've been a pro bono consultant to Martell Bivings, who's running for the congressional seat in Detroit that's currently represented by Sri Tandahar. And just anecdotally, what I hear from him, when he ran in 2022 with a team of people to gather signatures, you need 1,000 qualified signatures to get on the ballot for a congressional race. He struggled to get those signatures because he was a Republican. This time, he did it all by himself, and it was easy because he was a Republican. And to see it through Martel's eyes of what a struggle it was 2 years ago to where it is today. And he'd say, you know, I'd come up to a brother and I'd say I'm running for Congress, and they'd find out I was a Republican. They'd sign my petition, and then they'd go get a couple friends and bring them over to sign that petition. Meanwhile, the entire Detroit Democratic establishment, from Mayor Mike Duggan and County Executive Warren Evans, everyone who's frustrated that Detroit doesn't have a black member of Congress, they've got an Indian member of Congress, united behind a very well-qualified former state senator, Adam Ollier, who failed to get the 1,000 signatures with the entire Duggan and Evans political machine behind him. But I bring this up only that there is something going on in the black community that is real. And I think you look back at 2020, Trump got 13%, which in Detroit, which was double what he got in 2016, which I think was about 6%. It wouldn't surprise me if Trump got 20% out of the city of Detroit this time around. And if he can reduce that vote share out of Dearborn and from the Muslim voters, I think that's going to be important. And then again, going back to the youth vote, you know, I kept worrying about abortion, but abortion really was supercharged in 2022 with the ballot initiative to put it in the Constitution in Michigan. And I think at Michigan State, I think they got up to about 80% turnout on that.
Right.
And I did the Barrett campaign then. We didn't even go there. We're screwed. We can't even compete. This time we had an assigned staff. We were working fraternities. We were geo-targeting the campus and talking about protecting Zen of all these things. These bros at the college campuses love Zen. And the fact that we were talking about protecting their Zen rights, Tom on Sunday night went and worked the chapter circuit, meeting for the fraternities, and the fraternity brothers were having him sign their Zen tins. Like, this was a thing for them. So I think it reduces the impact of a higher Gen Z vote on these college campuses. But what I've found out anecdotally, one, a lot of these kids understand that in Michigan, abortion is protected in the Constitution. But you know what they care about more? Beer money, because they're broke. They can't. I mean, when I was in college in the late 80s and early 90s, if I had $20 on a Thursday night, I could get pretty drunk. These kids, for $20, they can get one craft cocktail or two beers. It's not really the night that I had as a Gen Xer. But also, these are kids that went to high school during COVID. They were robbed of their graduation. They were robbed of their proms. And so I was talking to Ed Duggan, who was heading up the Harris campaign in Michigan today, and we're friends. I'm like, what do you think? He has no idea. And I brought up some of these things, and he goes, I have no idea if we're going to do better with Gen Z or not, but we're just going for what we have to go for. So I think a lot of those three groups are interesting in Michigan as compared to the other states, because I think they're more important, all three of them, than they are in Wisconsin or in Pennsylvania or some of the Sun Belt states.
Well, Jason, thanks for that insight. We're going to keep following this. 29% of the vote in Michigan counted so far. Thanks so much for joining us, Jason. Go celebrate with your client. And we're going to bring in Stephanie Slade now to join the conversation. And let's zoom out a little bit. And hi, Stephanie. Thanks for joining us. Stephanie, senior editor at Reason Magazine, fellow in liberal studies at the Acton Institute. Guys, let's talk about big picture. We've been talking about the blue wall. I want to read some numbers here. 61% of the vote is in Wisconsin, and Donald Trump is at 50%. He's over 1 million votes. 30% of the vote is in Michigan. We were just talking about that. Donald Trump leading. 71% of the vote is in Pennsylvania. Donald Trump leading with 51%. I know there are going to be late votes coming in. Harris is going to make up some of that margin, but I mean, what do we think about this? We could be really talking about a Trump blowout electoral college speaking.
But the reason that we think that is because we are also assuming that we're not going to see the huge gap in those early votes and mail votes that, remember, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania did not start counting until today. Yep. Now, again, I don't expect it to be the blue overnight wave that we saw in 2020, but do expect it to lean more to Harris than to Trump. So for those states, the question isn't Trump's margin, it's how big his margin needed to be before her votes started coming in. What I'm more interested in looking at right now is the difference in where Harris is running compared to these Democratic Senate candidates. Democratic Senate candidates in every state are outperforming her. Gallego in Arizona, 7.5 points ahead of her. Brown in Ohio, 7 points. Osborne in Nebraska, 5.5 points. Allred in Texas, 5 points ahead of where Harris is. Baldwin in Wisconsin looks like she's running about 3.5 points. And the question that I think we will be trying to answer for the next several months is, did Trump win them, these split ticket voters, or did Harris lose them? And obviously I know Texas best, and I'm digging into some of these. And just so we're clear, this is not just vote drop off. You know, people who voted for president, they didn't bother voting in the Senate race, and that's why you can see some discrepancies. No, it is very clear that there were split ticket voters. There are Trump Allred voters in Texas. There are Trump Gallego voters in Arizona. And I think based on what Jason was just saying, you can make a case that, yeah, Harris is a bad candidate and blah, blah, blah. But actually, maybe Trump won them, not just that Harris lost them. And that, I think, is going to have a lot to do with where these two parties evolve in the next 4 years.
Yeah, we talked a lot about in the run-up the possibility of Harris presidency, but a Republican Senate. And voters may not have been thinking about that in some of those battleground states. In fact, maybe they were thinking the opposite. I could vote for Trump, but I'll vote for the Democrat.
I love split ticket voters coming back. They were dying. They were a quickly extinguishing breed, and like, bring them back and join the dispatch. We are split ticket people here. We love a split ticketer.
Yeah, but isn't this a perfect example of how all of our politics now takes the form of monkey paw wishes? Right? Like, I want the Republican Party to be a more racially diverse party. You know, I want the Republican Party to be more of a blue collar party. You know, and then this is what you get, right? But I'm with you. I hear you.
Stephanie, your thoughts on as you're seeing these results come in and Trump is sort of overperforming maybe what those of us in the media thought he could this time around.
Yeah, I'm more reluctant to draw conclusions about how he's doing in those 3 states, the blue wall states that haven't been called yet. There's still a lot of time for things to change there. But one state where 100% of the vote is counted is my home state of Florida. And we have seen some really interesting and I think telling results there. I mean, Miami-Dade County was a bellwether. It was one that was interesting 4 years ago because it was a sign, although Biden won Miami-Dade County, he won it by a much smaller margin than Hillary Clinton had won it 4 years earlier. And that told us that something was going on here. It was one of the first signs of like, wow, racial realignment alarm going off. And so one of the questions was, is this going to continue? Was that a fluke? You know, what's going to happen this year? And this year we saw it absolutely continue. In fact, we saw that county go 18 points in the direction of Republicans. This is very dramatic change, 40 plus points in 8 years in a county that was considered, a bright blue county not that long ago. And so this suggests that something, this was not a fluke 4 years ago. The narrative of racial realignment is not going anywhere. We're going to be having to spend a lot of time talking and thinking about this. Hispanic voters, drawing conclusions at county level data is a little bit fraught because we don't know for sure how individuals vote, but we know that a very, a county that's heavily Hispanic has undergone this journey. We saw that 4 years ago along the Rio Grande as well. Like, there's evidence that Hispanic voters, and as the last speaker was talking about, Black voters as well to a slightly lesser extent, but are moving in a direction that nobody saw coming 5 or 10 years ago, right? This was not an expected change. And so what do we make of this? How do we, I have thoughts about this. I think that there are often different conclusions that can be drawn from the same data. And one side of the sort of Republican coalition wants this to be an economic story, that Trump is the blue collar champion. I am much more persuaded by the idea that this is actually the Democratic Party driving more socially conservative minority voters and blue collar voters out of their coalition by being completely bonkers on cultural issues. So it's the woke extremism that's driving these voters out of the Democratic coalition, as opposed to, Trump calling for tariffs that's bringing them in. But this is going to be a topic we're going to have to spend a lot of time trying to understand going forward.
It's so interesting. It brings up to me another irony, which is I remember 10, 12 years ago, and long before that, there was this mantra that, oh, well, Hispanic voters will eventually come to the Republican Party because they're all Catholic and they're all socially conservative and we're the pro-life party. And it didn't happen for a long time. And then you have Donald Trump, nobody's idea of a social conservative on anything. Yes, the judges who he installed and et cetera. But I mean, just look at his campaign now in 2024. He basically pushed himself away from the pro-life movement and had them sort of running behind, saying, "Yes, no, we're with you. We promise we're with you." And yet here we are. It's really kind of nothing Republicans did, but maybe as you described, Stephanie, it's a sort of extremism on the Democratic side, which again doesn't get talked about a lot in the media because most of the media shares the sort of Democratic view on a lot of these social issues, and they don't necessarily understand where kind of Republican-leaning voters are coming from. What do you guys think of that? What I just said?
I think it's right. I mean,
all right, well,
co-sign.
let's close it down. Let's close down the live stream. I'm right. Let's move on. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Megan.
No, I just think people and institutions have, so something that Matt Iglesias wrote that I have said elsewhere and that I think a lot of other people are starting to grapple with was the tendency of Democrats to treat like quite elite upper income members of various groups as if they represented and could speak for the entire group. The most prominent example, obviously, is Latinx. Right. So that was actually a term that, as I understand it, like if the fact checkers find me wrong, I apologize. My understanding is that was in fact created by Latino queer people, but they were at academics who did not in fact have the mandate to negotiate this linguistic change on behalf of all of the other Hispanic people in the United States. And academics, and then increasingly people on Twitter and then the media, treated them as if like, oh, we've made that deal. We're going to change the name of your language to something, or of your identity group, to something that is not pronounceable in your language. And by the way, we're going to, in the process, suggest that your language is problematic because it's sexist. So like that whole thing, that play was replicated over and over and over again. And it took Democrats really way too long to figure out that was not a bad move. And I think that was not a good move. And I think that we are actually only starting. I'm not saying we as me, a Democrat, I am not a Democrat, but like we as a society are only starting to see that shift happen among cultural elites, where they start to understand that, like, if someone, Matt Iglesias is a good example, right? Cuban American, also Jewish, but like went to Harvard and is not really like empowered or even a good reference on the subject of people living in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. Right. And that is something that we understand intrinsically with white people and with women, that like, when you look at me, I can't speak for all women because I don't have the life of most women in the United States.
Megan. But this is why the they them ad I thought was so effective.
Yes.
The left constantly
describe that ad, Sarah.
Right, it was
Sarah
Kamala
gets all
Harris.
the good descriptions tonight.
Trump is for you, she's
Tell
for
the folks
they
at home.
them. And it was described, anytime I would turn on the TV as Trump's transphobic ad. They missed the point. The they them, of course, was a reference to people who put pronouns in their signature lines, but it wasn't about trans people. It was about everyone putting pronouns in their signature lines. And if you didn't put pronouns in your signature line, you were transphobic. It was about Latinx. It was about the language police and cancel culture. That's why the ad was effective. It had very little actually to do with actual trans anything.
And
there was a very good column on this in the Washington Post, by the way.
I got it.
But no, there were like, and there's also this thing of like, the reason that ad, one reason I think that ad was so effective was that it had taken, so Kamala Harris spoke at this Transform the White House event. And she is enthusiastically, they're like, so what will you do for trans people? And she's like, well, I personally pushed to make it so that transgender prisoners would get surgery. And I really and I used the power I had to advance the movement and frankly, the agenda. These are things that came out of her mouth and like on camera. And it apparently never occurred to her that like this very tiny slice of activists was not something, and it was not clipped out of context, unlike most of these ads, which are usually unfairly clipped out of context. This was something that, like, this was actually a pretty accurate summary of the conversation she had. And it apparently never occurred to her there might be any political risks to doing that.
I could speak from personal experience. My neighbor in Northern Virginia came over and talked to my wife about the election a couple of weeks ago and said, I was thinking of voting for Harris. And then I saw that she wanted to give trans surgery to illegal immigrants in prison. What's that about? Like that, like it sort of broke through. I think,
and that, by the way, again, is something that, you know, most trans people are not in prison. This is a teeny tiny population, and like, is this something that is even going to get you the trans vote? Do most trans people want us to fund surgery for people, for, in this case, a person who murdered a father of 3 in a really brutal fashion? This was this case she was celebrating. And I don't know, actually, like, I'm not speaking for the trans vote, with which for which I am definitely not empowered to speak. But I think that, like, there's also a fiscal and a crime angle to that I think was just like, this was a fringe of a fringe.
The other thing that
went there enthusiastically.
This related to this is that Democrats they sort of made this big bet that a sort of hectoring school marmish way of trying to like bully people into or shame them into, you know, doing the right thing was the way to go in the closing days of the campaign. I mean, the way they used the Obamas, or the way the Obamas chose to, you know, make their case, I think a great example of this. And I think that is exactly the thing that people are reacting against. This idea that, like, you're telling me how to live, you are shaming me for the things I believe, or for not, you know, sharing your elite mores. Like, this was a bet that was like really hard to understand in the moment, and is now, I think, pretty clearly being shown to be a really bad bet that they made.
Yeah. All right, we're going to bring in Chris Stirewalt. We've got him for a few minutes to sort of add to this conversation. There he is, the one and only Chris Stirewalt. Brother Stirewalt, what is going on? What is your read on just everything that's going on this evening?
Well, everybody's doing what they're supposed to do. The red states are redding. We don't know what the blue states are going to do. Right now, Kamala Harris is underperforming Joe Biden by a pretty consistent 3 points. Now, there is a whole scad, a giant ocean of urban vote yet to come in, right? But what we are seeing is pretty consistent across the country, which is 2 or 3 point shift. And in some places, especially in rural places, including places where Democrats traditionally do pretty well, it's been a big shift, right? This goes to Republicans' argument about the changing coalition. It goes to Republicans' arguments about doing better with downscale voters, doing better with non-white voters. We look at some places in the Rio Grande Valley, places like that, and you're seeing really substantial numbers. That's the good news for Republicans, and that's the part of the evening that we're in, which is the good news for Republicans part of the evening. And now in the next hour or so, we get to the part where Democrats will start to see some things that make them feel a little bit better. But I take it from the tenor of the conversation when I came in that Democrats generally, and based on how upset many Democrats were with our call at News Nation for North Carolina, Democrats are not getting the night that they hoped it would be.
I think that is safe to say.
From the Harris campaign, they're saying they're nauseously optimistic.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of reason to believe. So Wisconsin could be the kill shot. Well, that's a bad thing to use in a year with 2 assassination attempts. But Wisconsin could be the one, and just to state what I'm sure all of you erudite and insightful people have been saying before, any one of those 3 traditionally Democratic states is enough. I don't think that we're talking about Kamala Harris being competitive in Arizona. And she doesn't really need Nevada. I love you, Nevada, with your 6 electoral votes. You're great. But she just, no matter what, she's got to do the big 3. 8 years ago, Democrats were in this position. They know, and so they're playing the tape over in their head. They say, this is what it felt like when Hillary Clinton lost, and this is what's going to happen again. And maybe they're right. I don't know. But I don't see Donald Trump, while it is true that Kamala Harris is not doing what Joe Biden did, Donald Trump isn't yet doing what he did in 2016. Kamala Harris is landing so far someplace between Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton. Will it be close enough to 2020 to get over the hump and clear the hurdle in those states? Is it the most likely outcome right now? No. Is it a pretty solid possibility? Sure.
Yeah. Jonah, do you have thoughts, or you're just sort of musing and thinking about all this wisdom we're offering here?
I had so many thoughts, like watching pretty girls walk by me on the street for the last half hour. I can't even remember all the thoughts that I had. In fact, I'm shocked by the sound of my own
Prevagen,
voice.
Jonah? For those who have been watching a lot of political television over the last 6 months, that was a funny joke. For those who haven't,
the key ingredient comes from a jellyfish. It's always the way they say jellyfish that gets my attention. So, Brother Starwall, if you had to guess right now, when would we know who the next president of the United States is?
Well, if Wisconsin hurries up, well, I'll put it this way. If Donald Trump is going to win, we'll know in the next 3 hours, within the next 3 hours. If Kamala Harris is going to win, it'll be tomorrow. It'll be longer than that, because if we're going to a car crash in Pennsylvania, basically, I expect Harris to win Michigan. Maybe she doesn't, but of these remaining states, Nevada and Michigan should be her best. Wisconsin is the polling error state of polling error states, and who knows? But in the scenario where Kamala Harris wins this, she wins it in Pennsylvania, and she wins it in Pennsylvania on Thursday morning or something, right? That it goes on, and we're counting, because Republicans in Pennsylvania refuse to allow expeditious counting of the vote for a bunch of really awful reasons. And if they would oblige America and have a faster count, we wouldn't have to wait that long. But if a Harris win is, at this point, a Harris win is going to take longer to call than a Trump win.
Okay, I actually have to get going. But
Yes.
I wanted to just remind people that we're going to have the Dispatch Summit next week. Unfortunately, for all of the people who didn't sign up for it, it is now sold out. But you can still become a Dispatch member today, and you'll be able to unlock early access to future summits. And we're going to do a lot more of that kind of stuff, as well as local meetups. And you can become a member of the Dispatch by going to thedispatch.com/join. And also, for those of you who, are trying to keep a sunny outlook on life, and Megan doesn't need to have any comment on this whatsoever. There are rumors that there is considerable turmoil at the Washington Post, and it may be necessary for some people who work there to at some point seek refugee status at another publication. And we're going to
Or
keep
just
trying to
move
make
in
that
with me,
case.
Megan. Come live here. We could be so happy together.
One of us.
Got a cat and a fuzzy blanket with your name on it.
You know where you belong, Megan McCardle. You know where you belong.
All right. Well,
great to see you guys.
Jonah, go get some sleep. Thanks for joining us. Okay. Well, Chris, you said you think Michigan is, along with Nevada, are sort of Harris's best, states in the upcoming
Best of what's left. Yeah.
Of what's left. There was a kind of talk that Nevada was, was moving toward Trump, and that talk sort of hit the brakes, I think, in the last week before Election Day. And Nevada always sort of just within reach, but just out of reach for Republicans. Democrats seem to feel better about it in the final week. The polls aren't closed there. What are your thoughts on Nevada? And what to watch?
Low propensity voters are also hard to poll. And Nevada's Democratic coalition rests on a foundation of low propensity voters. The restaurant workers and hospitality workers of Clark and Washoe counties. Those are the folks who are the majority makers in Nevada, and one of the reasons why Republicans do better in biennial midterm years in Nevada. So I'm not saying that Kamala Harris will win Nevada. I'm saying that I don't look at Nevada polls. I guess that's what I would say is I learned a long time ago, Nevada poll, and annoyingly for America, two of the states that are left in the hopper, Nevada and Wisconsin, are very poll error, are poll error states, are frequent poll error states. So the way that the next 2 hours go for a Harris victory are we start to see the bubble come up in Pennsylvania. We start to see the vote really come in Allegheny County. She's getting closer. She was underperforming Biden in urban precincts by 3 points. Then it was 1.5 points. Now she's getting close to hitting the number, right? And so it's happening. And so what the next hour and a half looks like in a Harris win is Pennsylvania stabilizes. She gets where she needs to be. And then Wisconsin will dump a bunch of vote. Michigan, Wayne County, as you know, takes forever. But Wisconsin comes in and gives us lots and lots of good vote. And they've promised that they're going to do a good job. And that we get a bunch of vote in Wisconsin. And by midnight, what we're saying, by 1 a.m., we're saying, I don't know. It looks that way. And then we'll see about Nevada. The way a Trump win looks is that in the next hour, basically, one of those states looks like it's not coming back. One of those three upper Midwest states looks like it's not coming back.
Hey, Chris, can we talk down ballot? The Senate certainly looks like Republicans will hit 52, maybe looking at Deb Fischer in Nebraska, keeping them from that 53 mark. Who knows? I want you to talk about the Senate, but we're also, Decision Desk said Democrats are going to take the House. Fox News even floating that possibility. So tell us what's going on in the rest of our branches of government.
California can still deliver the House for Democrats. There's plenty of seats available in California. We don't have enough. When I came in to talk to you lovely people, there wasn't enough raw vote in California to true up the poll and see how it's really performing in California. But even a couple point shift, if the whole electorate has moved 2 points rightward since 2020, if that's true, there's still plenty in California to get it done. And then they'll scrap it out. But the thing about the House that we know is likely to be true is no one is going to have a useful majority, right? No one is going to have the kind of majority where you pass Obamacare or whatever. It's not going to be like that. In the Senate, here's where it gets very interesting. So we've called Ohio. That's done. I'm not seeing McCormick. McCormick has missed. It looks like McCormick's missed in Pennsylvania. And then we say, okay, could the Republicans get real lucky in Wisconsin? Could they get real lucky in Nevada? Or could Kerry Lake even annoy both parties? The most annoying thing for both parties, of course, is if Kerry Lake wins in Nevada or in Arizona, if Trump is overperforming by 3 points and wins Nevada or Arizona by 7 points instead of 3 points or something like that, if he goes big there, he could drag her across. So then we start looking at 52 becomes the floor. Are we looking at 53? Are we looking at 54? And
that makes a big difference because of Collins and Murkowski being sort of these squishier Republican votes when it comes to the filibuster.
You give Donald Trump a 54-seat Senate majority with Kerry Lake and Eric Hovde as part of that number. He could nominate the three Billy Goats Gruff for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Republican Senate would say, another capital idea, sir. You've done it. But at 52, right, as you very correctly say, Sarah, the Collins Murkowski, Mitt Romney's replacement in Utah, the Queasy Caucus, Tom Tillis, others say, whoa, too much. So the cushion, and we have to remember who would be in the cushion for Republicans. It would be Bernie Moreno's. It would be very MAGA-backed kind of folks that would go in. So the difference between constrained, and this is in a broader sense, what Republicans are thinking about across the country right now, which is, yay, it looks like Kamala Harris is going to lose. Oh no, now we have to spend 4 years with Donald Trump. Because if you look at how exhausted Republicans are from the closing weeks of the campaign and dealing with the ongoing crises of a Trump campaign and this, that, and the other thing, and which ethnic group has been insulted today and all of that stuff, Republicans who would be glad for Kamala Harris not to be president then have to think, okay, now how do we keep this guy who doesn't have to face voters again? How do we try to check him up? And as Mitch McConnell laughs over his shoulder as he steps down from Senate leadership.
All right. Chris, we know you have a lot of responsibilities tonight. Thanks so much for joining us.
I'm so glad to
sharing
be
these
with you
insights.
people in a sane, homey space. I feel so
That's where we
cozy,
are.
Sarah, looking at your bookshelves. See
about
you
my
guys.
sign?
Happy election night.
All right. Bye. Okay, we're gonna bring in another guest here, Mitch Kokai. Do I have that pronounced correctly, Mitch?
Close enough. It's Kokai.
Kokai. Okay. I was close enough. Mitch is a senior political director at the John Locke Foundation, which is a really great independent nonprofit think tank based in North Carolina. Mitch, thanks for joining us. North Carolina now been called for Donald Trump. This is a state that, Democrats have been chasing after since 2008 when they won it with Barack Obama. Why were they again just unable to put it in their column, even as the governor race in North Carolina went once again to the Democrats?
Well, and in a big way to the Democrats. This was a historically poor performance for the Republican candidate in this race. The last time I looked, Josh Stein, the Democratic Attorney General, was at 55%, and the Republican Lieutenant Governor, Mark Robinson, was at less than 40%, which in a state that typically has a landslide, if it's 52-48, that's a terrible performance. And you saw that once Mark Robinson started to underperform, and then when he had the big bombshell report on CNN about the strange and offensive comments on a pornography website from years ago, his support really started to crater. That's when Democrats decided to tie Mark Robinson to anyone they could. If you were going to run for dog catcher and you were a Republican, you were somehow tied to Mark Robinson. It's not clear that has really affected other candidates up and down the ballot, and it certainly didn't affect Donald Trump. And I think that's probably because, as we've seen elsewhere, Donald Trump is his own brand. mean, you know what Donald Trump has going for him and going against him, regardless of what's happening to anyone else. And I think there were enough folks in North Carolina, which probably, all things else being equal, leans a little bit more toward Republicans than Democrats. Not a lot. It is certainly a state that can be won by either major party. And that's one reason why Democrats pushed so hard. They came within 75,000 votes last time. It was a 1.3 point percentage gap between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And so they certainly saw this as a state they could flip. They tried to flip. Last I looked, though, Trump is up by 2.4 points with 86% of the precincts reporting. And as you said, calls now that he has won the state, but not by a lot. And it's certainly going to be one that both parties will try to win again in 2028.
Yeah, North Carolina is one of these states on the presidential level. It's said on the other side about Minnesota, right? It's consistently Republican, but it's not very Republican. And I think it's so interesting. I saw Bill Clinton campaigning there on behalf of Kamala Harris. They certainly did try to turn out black voters in North Carolina. But the story seems to me, at least in North Carolina and Georgia, rural voters, Donald Trump turning out even more in these rural counties than I ever thought was possible. I thought he had sort of maximized in 2020 the rural vote. He seems to have gotten even more out in certainly North Carolina, and we'll see in some of these other states.
And that was interesting. And that was interesting to see in some respects because of the storm that came through. The tropical storm, by the point it got to North Carolina, Helene, came through the western part of the state, which, other than the counties that surround Asheville and Boone, which is the home of Appalachian State University, which are blue counties, everything else in the West is a red county. And if you totaled up the votes from 2020, Biden versus Trump, Trump's winning margin in Western North Carolina, the part that got slapped by the storm, was far larger than his overall victory margin in the state. So the fact that he was able to get rural voters out, and including rural voters, many of whom had no home or they just got back in their home and have no power, that was a strong message for him here in North Carolina.
All right, Stephanie, any thoughts on North Carolina? Again, a state that Republicans keep holding cycle after cycle.
Yeah, I don't have much to add here. I think that I would have thought that given the unique circumstances of this disaster that the state is still trying to get to, crawl out from under, that we would be saying like, well, you can't really draw any conclusions about this that would, be that we could extrapolate for future elections or whatever. But I wouldn't have predicted that the results would look like they did, given all of that. And so I don't know. I think this is a really interesting one. It's like one of these examples where we're going to have to spend a lot of time looking back at it and trying to understand what happened and what are the lessons we want to take from it after the fact.
And I should throw in here that there are some other things up and down the ballot in North Carolina that are kind of interesting, that show that, as in some other cycles, we're a state where people like to split their ticket and they will vote one way. We've often had the situation, we had the last two election cycles, what we called the Cooper Trump voters, people who voted Donald Trump for president, but then Roy Cooper for governor, who's a Democrat. He was term limited, which is why he couldn't run this time, but you may remember was for a while considered a potential candidate to run alongside Kamala Harris as a vice president because he had won 6 statewide elections in North Carolina, 4 as attorney general and 2 as governor. We have a number of interesting races here. One that people with DC connections might care about, and that is our race for attorney general, because we had 2 sitting congressmen who decided to leave DC to try to become our attorney general. One was Dan Bishop, well known for being part of that conservative wing that often served as a thorn in the side for the Republican House leadership. And on the other side, a TikTok star, Jeff Jackson, who is a younger guy who has millions of followers on TikTok and use that to his advantage. It looks at this point as if Jackson has won this race. And of our 10 statewide executive branch positions that we elect in North Carolina, we elect everything, including an ag commissioner and an insurance commissioner. It looks like at this point, they're going to end up being split 5-5 Republicans and Democrats. We also see a Republican legislature that, if things stand as they are today, a legislature that had veto-proof supermajorities might not be in that situation come 2025. It looks like the state Senate remains a veto-proof supermajority for Republicans, but the House may come up a couple votes short, which will mean Josh Stein's veto will be a lot stronger than it would be if Republicans could just say, well, that's nice, but we're going to throw this veto away and pass the bills anyway. So, and we had one state Supreme Court seat that was really waged hard by the Democrats because they have a 5-2 minority on the state Supreme Court now. And basically the only seat up was the Democratic seat. And they said, look, this is the start of our comeback. We got to win this seat. We got to win a seat the next time around. And then in 2028, we can start fighting the Republicans and win their seats. So it looks like the Democrats might keep that seat as well. So if you look at North Carolina, up and down the ballot, people go, all right, on one hand, I'll vote Republican. On one hand, I'll vote the Democrat. And you end up with sort of a strange mix of results.
All right. Well, Mitch, thank you so much for joining us, giving us that rundown of the 50-50 state that is North Carolina. Appreciate you joining us. Stephanie Slade, any final thoughts as we say goodbye to you? Thanks so much for joining us. Any final thoughts on big picture on this election?
Yeah, well, maybe not big picture, but I think it's worth just reminding people that there are lots of ballot initiatives and things that don't have anything to do with the presidential race that are being decided. A lot of attention, of course, being paid to things like the abortion initiatives in various states. But there's also several places, including Washington, D.C., where a few of us live, that were voting on ranked choice voting initiatives that seems to have passed in DC. So this is going to be interesting. Also, it's going to be even more excitement for future elections as we're starting to experiment with different sort of structures for how we go about electing people down the line. So there's never going to be a dull moment going forward. It'll be interesting to see how it bringing in ranked choice voting in more districts changes things in the future.
All right, Stephanie, thanks so much for being here with us tonight. You can go get some rest now. We're going to bring in a couple of Wisconsinites, I believe. We're bringing in Sarah Craig Gilbert, who's a veteran reporter, was the former Washington bureau chief for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. And I remember, Craig, I remember seeing you. You probably don't remember. I remember meeting you around town here in D.C. when I was first starting. And then, of course, we have Steve Hayes, our hold on, Sarah, you're on mute. You're on mute. Oh, my goodness.
We have another Wisconsinite.
Wow. Oh, there we go. So we got 3 Wisconsinites here on.
Sorry, I didn't bring my cheese head.
That would be a little too much, don't you think? But Steve Hayes is also back with us. And Craig, tell us what's going on in Wisconsin. Last I checked, something like 70% of the vote is in. Donald Trump is at 51%. Is this Donald Trump's state to lose? And with that,
I think at this point,
his election.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I think it is his state to lose. I mean, it's going to be hard. Last time I looked, he had a margin of about 75,000 votes, with about 70% of the vote in. Now that's already probably a bigger margin than Democrats can make up with absentee ballots in Milwaukee, because there are fewer of them this time. So they're not going to get the kind of boost from the 3 o'clock in the morning absentee ballot dump that Joe Biden got 4 years ago. And you know what, the difference I see in these 2 elections is that in 2020, you had, pretty much half the state getting bluer and half the state getting redder. You had a lot of smaller counties where Trump performed a little bit worse than he did in 2016. And of course you had the big counties like Dane and Milwaukee, and the suburban counties like Waukesha, where Trump did considerably worse in 2020 than he did in 2016. But in this election, most of the state has gotten better for Trump. And I think Dane is kind of flat. I mean, it's not it may get up to the level of 2020 when it's all said and done, but I don't think it's going to add to it. And we still don't know in the case of Milwaukee. And the Democrats did do a little bit better in Waukesha, but that trend kind of flattened out a little too, whereas Donald Trump has continued to make big inroads in rural Wisconsin.
Steve, you're on mute. I know you have a great question for Craig.
Sorry.
There we go.
As you look, Craig, at the numbers coming out of these various places, and you think back about your coverage of the state and the time that you spent just over the past couple of weeks in Wisconsin, going to rallies and things, are there issues that you think resonated more for Donald Trump, or are there sort of strategic decisions that the Trump campaign made, the Harris campaign made, that seem to be validated by the results that we're seeing?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's a little too soon for me to try to, draw conclusions about tactics and strategy. I mean, it's not an original thought, but it does kind of feel like a classic, anti-incumbent election in the sense that, if you you can't take Trump out of the equation, but if you set aside, all of his unique negatives, this is kind of like the election you'd expect, right? Where the map would move away from the party in power when you've got an unpopular incumbent president, and you've had all this sort of economic disruption and lingering, frustration about inflation. What I don't know, and that I think that part is obvious. I don't know if it's the whole story, and I don't know. I think a lot of people are kind of focused on sort of the identity politics of this election and the kind of cultural hot buttons and the messaging at the end. I honestly don't know how pivotal any of that stuff was.
But I think just on that big point, and Sarah, feel free to jump in too, in the Wisconsin exit polls, the people who voted for change, 29% of them voted for Kamala Harris, 69% of them voted for Donald Trump. Yeah. Nobody should be surprised about that. It's very close to the right track, wrong track number. As we mentioned earlier, Kamala Harris had many opportunities to try to create some distance with Joe Biden and just chose not to do it. I think people will look back at that strategy and certainly second guess it. I mean,
I think that is a good point. I mean, that is a good point. She, if there's one thing and the most obvious thing to second guess about her campaign, and I know people will end up second guessing a lot of things, but the one thing that I think is most self-evident is just that, the fact that she could have done more and certainly done better at distancing herself or just articulating, what she would have done differently and what she thinks they should have done differently. So, yeah, I think that's a fair critique.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to keep watching, Wisconsin, but I mean, I keep looking at those numbers tick up, and the longer Trump is at 51% in these blue wall states, it's just harder.
One thing, one note about that. I mean, I took a look at the third party vote, and I think, with RFK still on the ballot in Wisconsin and Michigan, I think Democrats were hoping that would take something out of the Trump vote. But in the end, the third party vote, the combined third party vote is running at under 2 points. Yep. And it's running at less than it was 4 years ago when it was small. So that didn't happen. And I think that hurt Harris. We've got an interesting Senate race where, Tammy Baldwin is running just enough ahead of Harris to at least, have a chance to win this race. She may lose it in the end. We don't know yet, but I think it's too close to call, but we could have a split outcome. And there's an interesting kind of regional pattern there with Eric Hovde, the Republican candidate for Senate, appears to have outperformed Donald Trump in some of these suburban areas, but underperformed him in some of the rural areas, which is kind of a classic pattern in Wisconsin.
All right. Well, that's so interesting. I was in Madison last week, and I heard Robert F. Kennedy Jr. both complain about not being taken off the ballot in Wisconsin and Michigan, and then urge very strongly for nobody to vote for him. It was
Well, apparently
just
the message got through.
exactly. Okay, we're going to bring in Noah Rothman as well, who's joining us. Craig, I'm sorry. Thank you for joining us. I didn't say goodbye, but thanks again. Noah Rothman is here, senior writer at National Review, author of The Rise of the New Puritans. Thanks so much for joining us, Noah. All right, we're looking at a race that could be called very soon. If the numbers keep going the way they are for Donald Trump in the famed blue wall. Noah, what's your immediate reaction to these results?
Well, I'm coming in so late here. I'm sure you guys have covered the entire waterfront when it comes to recriminations, but let me get some in just in case. The victory defeat scenarios here are also overdetermined. I wrote a piece, I think, in August that was about the degree to which both any scenario could be an of course scenario. Donald Trump lost. Of course, Donald Trump lost. There's absolutely no way that a candidate with that much baggage, who'd been rejected as he had by the voters just 4 years prior, would be reelected, and it was foolish to renominate him. Same thing applies to Kamala Harris. She inherited an administration that was broadly unpopular with a decrepit president who was not trusted, who promised to govern from the center and betrayed his promise. And she herself is this Bay Area progressive, right? Who herself was a cipher and failed in large measure to perform at a standard that we expect from presidents when it comes to speaking extemporaneously. She just struggled with that. But she herself made a fair amount of mistakes, or campaign made a fair amount of mistakes. I think picking Walz was a mistake. I said it in the beginning. He was not an asset at the very least. The pivot to fascism was itself a little weird and kind of a betrayal of the campaign's understanding that it was losing ground. The joy phase, for all the heartache that it gave Republicans, because it was relatively vapid and not substantive, was nevertheless pretty clever as campaigning goes. It was an innovative strategy, and the retreat back to Joe Biden's themes, the themes that were not working when he was retailing them, was in retrospect evidence of the campaign's sort of misguidedness. And then lastly, just the outreach to Republicans that this campaign invested so much resources in. Actual, campaign funding and putting spots together and running those spots. It was so discordant. At no point did she offer any Republicans something to hang their hats on in terms of policy, to give them some way to say to their friends, well, she'll be a proper steward of my center-right interests. It was a campaign of emotional blackmail. It was predicated on the notion that men are bizarrely controlling of their spouses and kind of mistrustful of them, and women are in fear of them, and that January 6th should be the sole motivating factor for voters. It's a very important thing for me, but it wasn't registering in polling, and it turns out they weren't seeing anything we weren't seeing.
I find it, very big picture here. Harris made mistakes in her campaign, no question about it. But frankly, she never should have been put in this position. Biden should have announced after the 2022 midterm, January of 23, that he wasn't running again. Democrats could have had a primary at that point. Even if Harris had won the primary, and I don't think she would have been able to actually run and learn from and smooth out those edges over a full campaign. She was asked to do something in 3 months that simply, I don't think, was really possible. But the effect of that, I don't think, will really be people blaming Biden nearly to the extent that they should. Most people will simply see the immediate, like, Harris lost, Hillary lost. I don't see another political party nominating a woman for 20 years. And the funny thing about that is, I don't think Hillary or Harris lost because they were women. There's very specific reasons why both of them lost. And so I feel like we can focus too much on the mistakes the Harris campaign made. And they did. They made plenty of mistakes, but so did the Trump campaign. Campaigns make mistakes. The winning campaign doesn't do everything right. The losing campaign doesn't do everything wrong. I just wonder whether really there was ever a path for Harris. As we're looking at these numbers don't look like there was a moment there.
I think it's both and, right? And I think this is very difficult for her because she would have had to create more distance between her 3-month campaign and her 3+ years as Joe Biden's vice president on policy, and from the economic challenges that voters were concerned about. But also, I do think on a fundamental level, the fact that Joe Biden left the race because he couldn't keep running and he couldn't serve another term. That didn't happen overnight, and I think voters quite rightly said, you were there. You were in all these meetings. Now you want us to trust you? And I will say one of the interesting things as I was reporting this story I worked on about Wisconsin is, I talked to Wisconsin voters who were sort of disaffected Republicans, anti-Trump conservatives, whatever you want to describe them as. And I was surprised at the number of them. None of this was sort of on the record meetings, just talking to strategists, talking to rank and file Wisconsin voters who were willing to go back to Trump or were unwilling to vote for Kamala Harris, who had voted for Biden in 2020. They were frustrated. They thought, Biden, they could sort of park their vote with Joe Biden in 2020 because he was non-threatening. He was saying he would be the normie opposite sort of Trump's chaos. And they were willing to take that chance. And again, I heard from them, Kamala Harris doesn't give us the same assurances. And to the point Noah made about any policy concessions, she had the opportunity to do that. And there was a really interesting, I think several times that this sort of jumped out, but I was watching a brief rally with Tim Walz and the mayor of Waukesha, Wisconsin, Sean Riley, who's a Republican and endorsed and voted for Kamala Harris. And Riley gets up and he gives this very short speech saying basically, look, it was about January 6th. I couldn't do it again. I'm frustrated with Trump. I'm voting for Kamala. And then Tim Walz takes the microphone and says, we appreciate this support. This is what this is all about. America coming together. Da, da, da. And therefore, and then rattles off a series of pretty far left policy positions. And I mean, it's unrealistic to suggest that they would have abandoned those or de-emphasized those. But at the same time, if you're a Republican and you're looking for some place to go, and you're sort of you understand the first part of that speech from Sean Riley, and you hear the second part and you say, wait, these are the people who are going to be in charge, not the mayor of Waukesha.
I was struck. I went to several Walz events in the last month or so of the campaign, and I was struck at how incongruent the sort of pitch for Walz was when he was selected as the running mate. Hey, he's a liberal Democrat, but he comes from that sort of Trump adjacent world. He's a hunter, he's from the upper Midwest and these sorts of things. And then his campaign speeches, his stump speech was just, as you just described, Steve, one sort of progressive agenda item after another. And, he spoke to, I saw him in North Carolina in Buncombe County in Asheville, which is sort of a liberal bastion of Western North Carolina, and in Durham, which is the most educated city in North Carolina, one of the most educated cities in the country. Everybody there, with a college degree and probably more than one. And I didn't see what the promise of Walz was. And I just think that was obvious if you ever listened to their pitch.
I mean, it was so counterproductive because to throw in those progressive desiderata, those wish list items, undermines your economic message. There's this poll that was conducted by Joel Berenson and Neil Newhouse that I continually cite from around 2021, early 2022, which found that something like 71% of independent voters they surveyed agreed with the statement, I'm paraphrasing, that price instability, that inflation, as you experience it, will continue to get worse until the federal government gets its fiscal house in order, which is to say that voters made an intuitive connection between profligacy in Washington and their deteriorating financial circumstances. And they made the connection because profligacy in Washington was in service to progressive wish list items. That was something that Democrats had to see because we saw it. And they ignored it. They subordinated it to cultural messages. And the biggest cultural messages that I think they're going to have to reassess, I heard you talking with Megan about some of the trans stuff and what have you. And yeah, that really hurt them among center-right voters. But Kamala Harris just cratered with Hispanics. Democrats are going to find themselves in this mirror image position that the GOP found themselves in 2012, in which they had to have a real soul-searching moment about how we talk to Hispanics. And that was a painful, prolonged process for the GOP that ended up coming up with a lot of wrong answers because Donald Trump sweeps in and comes up with the right answer, which turns out to be far more belligerent, far more steadfast, at least in whether or not, you know, you agree with his outlook on things. The man knows his himself. He knows his thoughts. He knows his own mind. Can't say that about Kamala Harris. I don't know Kamala Harris's own mind. I don't know if she does. She's a creation of her environment and the milieu in which she was steeped, which was Democratic, intra-Democratic politics in California all the way up the chain to the presidential nomination without ever having to face voters on the scale that she faced them here. And it found out that all those messages they road tested with their progressive, left-leaning at the very least, constituencies ended up turning off a broader universe of voters. And maybe it's only clear in retrospect, but it's the sort of thing that we probably should have had an inkling of earlier on. And I fell prey to that too, especially after the Seltzer poll. And it seemed to jibe with...
This is the Iowa poll that suggested
poll.
Things were closer for Trump in Iowa than they ended up being.
And it was indicative of, as according to Ann Seltzer's write-up and the DMR write-up, independent-minded older women gravitating fast and hard to the Harris camp. And it seemed to jibe with public polling nationally, which suggested independents were moving over to her camp. That made a lot of sense to me. And that suggested that maybe, you know, pollsters had figured out how to account for the hidden Trump vote. But it turns out they did not. And in fact, the hidden Trump vote was hiding in plain sight. It was just harder for us to see it, for me at least, to see it over the undesirable qualities of Donald Trump himself. But his message, the message that he was retailing, and the red wave that materialized around it, and this is a red wave. It looks like it's going to carry a lot of office seekers who are not favored to win this election into office. That message was resonating regardless of who was retailing it. There's a lot of lessons there for the GOP and the Democrats alike.
Well, if it is true that we're sort of repeating what the Republicans went through post 2012 on the Democratic side, maybe this all ends with a reality TV star who's been on TV for several years and is also a rich guy whose name may rhyme with Bark Boobin or something like that, running for the Democratic nomination in 4 years. Who knows? Noah Rothman, thank you very much for joining us. Sarah Isgur, we're going to let you say goodbye. Steve Hayes, we're not letting you go yet because you have something to say.
Yeah, I've got sort of an exciting announcement. At least it's an announcement that we're excited about for Dispatch members and newbies. We're excited to announce our new Dispatch Premium tier. If you've been with us and you're a member, you know that this was coming. But premium membership is for people looking to increase their dedication to the kind of high quality journalism that we produce. And in addition to unlimited access to all of our articles, newsletters, members only live streams, the comment section, et cetera, it comes with additional benefits, the premium membership, including 2 additional annual subscriptions you can give to friends and family. So that covers sort of the value of this right away. Ad-free podcasts, priority registration to members only events, 2 exclusive virtual town hall meetings with founders, editors, and staff for a look at sort of what's happening with the Dispatch, but also sort of what's going on behind the scenes in Washington. We'll host those on Zoom, so it's actually more interactive. A note to current Dispatch members, if you upgrade your membership, we will automatically calculate a prorated amount based on the remaining time of your current subscription. You can learn more and upgrade to premium at thedispatch.com/premium. Remember, we're running an early special adopted promotion tonight. You can take 50% off the cost of premium. That's 3 total dispatch subscriptions, ad-free listings, et cetera, for $250. So go to dispatch.com/premium. Use the code premium to unlock the promotion.
All right.
Thank you very much. I think, Mike, I'm
Steve.
done. I'm leaving
You're
you.
done.
I've got to go to, I've got the overnight shift at NBC News. So if anybody's still watching things from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., join me on NBC News.
All right. Put on a pot of coffee there.
Definitely going to need it.
All right. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks.
We're going to bring Megan McArdle back to the program, and we're going to bring in 2 new folks for this evening. Jamie Weinstein is here. You know him from our Monday Dispatch podcast. He the interview Dispatch podcast. Jamie is here. And also we have Sharon McMahon, a former teacher, who now teaches folks online about politics and government. She's on Instagram at Sharon Says So, and writes a popular newsletter called The Preamble, which you can find at thepreamble.com. Megan, Jamie, Sharon, thank you so much for joining us. It is no longer election day. It is after midnight here on the East Coast, at least. And it's looking like Donald Trump, it feels like 2016 again. Donald Trump is in a really good position to win another term as president. Thoughts on this, Jamie? Let's start with you. Your reaction to what we're seeing as these votes keep coming in.
Well, it's remarkable that Donald Trump has lived a uniquely American life, as much as I think things like January 6th should play into things. Most of the American public doesn't, and he's almost like the picture of the portrait of Dorian Gray book. There's a painting of him somewhere, and he just keeps winning, as he would say, despite
it's hanging in Mar-a-Lago. He's got a sweater on. I've seen it. So
right. In fact, I think Tucker
exactly
right now is doing a show below it. If I saw the Tucker feed correctly, it's pretty remarkable. And my immediate thought goes to not catastrophizing the outcome. I didn't support him. I didn't vote for him. I voted for the vice president. I do think there is a risk there, but I don't think it's inevitable that it's a disaster or an overall disaster. I think there is a potential upside. I think the thought has to go to how to mitigate the downside. Who are the people that might go around him that he's very susceptible to flattery. Who are the people going to be in his ear? How can you get good people in his ear as opposed to bad people? I do think the greatest risk is who he appoints to attorney general and who they, what type of revenge he might go after to his greatest enemies, Mark Milley, Liz Cheney, those type of people, whether that be audits or legal threats. But I think we got to hope for good people to surround him. And remember, he's 78 years old. Biden declined as he was in office at that age. Trump, too, might decline at his office. I think the question goes to, who is J.D. Vance exactly? Is he the new J.D. Vance? Is there some element of David Frum, I know, might be coming on the show. I asked him this in one of the interviews. He knew the old J.D. Vance. Which J.D. Vance would appear if he actually was in the position of president? And I do think that's an interesting question. Is it the one that he doesn't care about Ukrainians at all and says these bombastic things, or is it the one who said today that we got to be a administration for all people? I don't know the answer to that. I always tend to not try to catastrophize after an election, so I try to think, how do you mitigate the down risks of what looks to be another Trump presidency? So that's where my head is at the moment.
And I just want to say we've got David Frum, senior editor at The Atlantic, former speechwriter for George W. Bush, also joining us. Thanks for joining us, David. We'll come to you in a second, but I wanted to go to Sharon on this question because Jamie brought up sort of, you call it sort of a list of horribles about either Donald Trump's term in office or sort of what he's done since we haven't even really talked about the legal troubles that he was in and seemed to have dodged. All of that, for those of us who pay very close attention to this, is sort of is top of mind when we think about Donald Trump. It either doesn't seem to be the case with voters, or with a majority of voters, or with a majority of voters in the key swing states that it takes to win the Electoral College, or they simply don't care about it, dismiss it. You're talking about politics and government with folks online. Help us make sense of this, particularly for those of us who are so in tune that probably blinds us to how other voters see Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think it's easy when you work in like an academic sense, or you work in a newsroom. It's a different thing when you are literally talking to tens of thousands of people on a daily basis. I get over 10,000 DMs a day. Certainly can't read every single one of them, but I'm hearing directly from people on a regular basis. And one of the things that I have been hearing about people who are sort of holding their nose and voting for Trump, which is a pretty large percentage of Trump voters. I think we tend to think of Trump voters as the people who have the MAGA wear and the flags on their truck and, all of those kinds of things. And that certainly is a percentage of the voters, but there's probably even as large or greater percentage who are holding their nose and voting for Trump because they cannot bring themselves to vote for Harris. And that's true for a variety of reasons. Some of it has to do with the fact they've been lifelong Republicans. They just can't vote for a Democrat. They can't get over that hurdle. For a lot of people, it's abortion. For a lot of people, it comes down to the issue of abortion, about their view on how Trump will bring this issue more into line with their deeply held viewpoints. So I do think there's this sort of contention that's going to have to happen between this wing of the party that is pro-Trump no matter what, and the Trump voters who, again, feel like I just had no good options. And I guess I had lower grocery costs in 2019. So I guess I'm going to have to go with that. That's honestly, for a lot of people, what it came down to is just like, I don't like any of it. I'm going to have to go with cheaper groceries. I'm going to have to go with more pro-life policies. I do think that's like a big chunk of the voters out there. And also, I know in your previous segments, you were talking about how Harris messaging perhaps failed. We're seeing headlines now about, like the Harris watch parties turning off the returns and just playing music. And that is certainly a signal that they do not like the direction in which things are trending. I do think the post-mortem on what's going to be happening within the DNC, if in fact Trump wins, it's not entirely a foregone conclusion at this point, but if in fact Trump wins, I think one of the things that is going to have to be reckoned with is how much of Harris's messaging was focused on Trump. The slogans were, "We're not going back." That was the slogan. It was not necessarily casting a vision for the future of, here are the policies I am going to enact that are going to make your life substantively better. And when the messaging is, we are not going back, that certainly resonates with a certain percentage of voters, especially the people who saw what happened on January 6th and were horrified. But for a lot of people, the idea of like cheaper groceries and their view of a closed border, actually people do want to go back to that. A subset of people do want to go back to that. So we'll see how this plays out, but I do think that's going to be part of the conversation.
David, I think Sharon is right that there are a large chunk of people who voted for Trump who were sort of thinking about those kind of pocketbook issues or just thinking what's better for my budget. But when you win, and certainly when Donald Trump wins, it doesn't matter how he wins. He gets to continue to shape the Republican Party. Conservative movements, such as it still exists, will continue to be shaped by Donald Trump. If things continue to go the way they're going, how do you see those two parts that were so alien? Donald Trump was so alien to 8 years ago that he is now so tied to. What happens in the future? from
Well,
this.
yeah, I don't think it's. I don't feel confident when I say why did voters do something, because there are tens of millions of people. It's hard to aggregate why they did it. But I can tell you some things that happen very fast if Donald Trump does indeed emerge the winner. We're going to see a big round of tariffs. And one of the things that Donald Trump does not believe is that other countries can retaliate against U.S. tariffs, but they can and they will. He's got this argument that the foreigner pays the tariffs. Now, that's not true, but even if it were, okay, if the foreigner pays American tariffs, who pays the foreigner tariffs? Because there will be retaliation. We are going to see a spasm of crisis in the international trade system. That's one thing we're going to see quite early. Second thing that we are going to see that's within his power to do is the cutoff of assistance to Ukraine. They have now a finite number of days to bring as satisfactory an outcome to the war as they can. After that, it's game over for them. Trump will turn off the aid flow and will push them into some kind of unfavorable deal with the Russians. And the last thing we know that will happen is if Trump emerges the winner, there will be a de facto amnesty for January 6th. And a shutdown of all the investigations of Donald Trump, that there will be a retroactive legalization of everything that is illegal. And I wonder if that changes the country's attitude to political violence, because it worked.
Yeah. Megan.
Oh, sorry. The
No,
worst
it's
thing
okay.
about
You
this,
were on mute.
if it's him, is that it legitimizes the tactic of denying that you lost an election you lost. And the reason he did that is twofold. Number one, because he is a narcissist who could not bear to admit that he lost, but also because that kept his political fortunes alive. Normally you lose an election. There is an exception, Richard Nixon in 1960, but with Richard Nixon in 1960, there was a big feeling in his party that the election had been stolen. And so it keeps his electoral chances alive by doing this, by saying, I didn't actually lose. I won this election. If it had been counted fairly, I would have won, which was completely false, to be clear. But by doing that, he preserved his ability to run again. And this has now vindicated that as a political strategy. It has not vindicated it morally, to state the obvious, but it worked. If he wins, that means it worked. And that means that other people are going to try this. Now, for various reasons, I'm actually not sure how many will try it and how many will get away with it. Because one thing that has been interesting is that no one else in his party has succeeded in doing this. It has been, and that is some combination of personal honor and the fact that they just aren't good at it. That he has some sort of weird force field around him that allows him to get away with stuff other people can't. But I certainly think we are going to see more of this in the future because it worked for him. And candidates who want to try to do that again, they lost an election, they want to run again next time, instead of their party saying, thank you for playing, there will be some lovely parting gifts. I think we are definitely going to see that again. And that's really, I think, absolutely, leaving all policies aside, I'm very upset about what's going to happen in Ukraine. I'm very upset about tariffs. But the worst thing is that this has given other future candidates the incentive to try the same thing.
Is that the case? I mean, we have found that just in the general political context, Republicans who try to ape Trump just in the way they speak and those sorts of things, they don't succeed because they're not Trump. On that very point, is Megan right that we're going to see more attempts by other elected officials, Republicans, to do some of the more, not just gauche things, but the more dramatic, possibly illegal things that Trump has attempted?
I don't know about it in the narrow frame of political competition, but here's the example. Supposing Trump, this is something that the president can't do quite so unilaterally as he can do the tariffs and the cutoff of Ukraine. But supposing Trump does try to make progress toward his vision of mass detention of illegal aliens, roundups, holding facilities of some kind, because it will be hard to repatriate people. And if they're rounded up, they will have to be held somewhere. How does one explain to people on the left why, confronted with something that they think is so morally outrageous, they shouldn't use force to try to liberate people in camps? Why is that bad? Donald Trump, the president, use force when he thought his rights had been violated. Why shouldn't more people? There are a lot of guns in this country. I fear there are about to be a lot more.
Interesting.
I do think, Michael, you have a point, though, that Donald Trump is a pretty unique figure. And what he can do, and others don't seem to be able to do themselves. I don't think Don Jr. can be Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump has the ability, and I think, David, when you joined me on the podcast, you kind of explained in 2016 the difference between Trump and Hillary Clinton. She dissembles in a way that a normal politician does, because she's trying to at least, not blatantly just spout lies, where he has no problem or compunction just saying something's not true, even if he knows for a fact it is true. You almost need to have some type of celebrity with a bigger than type personality who knows kind of the way to deal with the media like celebrities do, as opposed to politicians. Just like Trump went through every top-notch guy in 2016. It was the best field of Republicans we've ever seen. And he just, one by one, just blew them away as if they had no talent whatsoever. I do think, it does leave a precedent for these violations to occur, but I don't think there are that many people out there that are Donald Trump. And to the extent he has a talent, there is a talent there that he is able to do certain things and get away with it that, almost no one else is able to do. I mean, Boris Johnson kind of in the UK had that ability, but it's very, very rare.
I think that's a fair point, but in the same way that like Stacey Abrams and Hillary Clinton doing much lesser, to be clear, but still not good. This election wasn't really legitimate. I didn't really lose. There were various reasons that I actually really should hold office. Just as that made it harder to maintain the firewall against Trump, I think, having a bunch of politicians try this, first of all, it then creates all of the people who didn't stop them, which makes it hard for them to speak up against, it makes people listen less. It gives the other side an obvious retort. I just worry that this has broken down a law, a norm that really needed to stay very intact. And I think both sides have hacked it a little, but obviously Donald Trump by far the biggest offender on this.
I don't disagree with that.
Score. One question to Megan's point, one question that I have been thinking about a lot is you mentioned the 1960 election and about which Richard Nixon was very bitter, but you can see on YouTube the ultimate speech that Nixon gave when he had to, as vice president, preside over his own defeat in January of 1961. And he gave a speech whose main theme was, I hope the men in the Kremlin are watching this. And I wonder how many of the things we call norms were in fact practices of the Cold War, when the country faced a protracted existential crisis and a need for unity at home. And this is we've had some very dark days in this country's history. We had this moment where we truly felt from the experience of the Depression and the war, and then and not that the Cold War was not divisive, there was McCarthy and things like that, but the leadership class of the country basically felt we have to stick together or we'll be separated by foreign powers in ways that are radically unacceptable. With the end of the Cold War, we're back to a different period in American history when politics was played more roughly, when elections were tampered with, and when cultural divisions were very raw, and when violence was very real. The elections of the 19th century were very, very violent things. Again, we're gentler people than we were 150 years ago, but we may be a less gentle people than we were 50 years ago.
Can I propose that maybe less worrisome than at least in the immediate of someone denying elections? It will be the kind of the downgrading of who to trust that really occurs here. People like Jack Proziak are now going to be, they have been rising figures. The conservative and Republican and mainstream these days, because Trump is president, information infrastructure are going to be some of these whack jobs who just insert, kind of what Bill Buckley tried to push out with the John Birch Society are now, maybe who will be someone who's going to be like a press secretary in the White House. And Tucker is now broadcasting from Mar-a-Lago. So, what is true and what is not, it's going to be much easier to deny something that, previously was obviously true, when you have all these new kind of nonsense news outlets now kind of gonna be very solidified in the firmament of they might get the front row of I think Hugh Hewitt thinks that Ruthless podcast is maybe replace the AP in the front row of the press room. I think this stuff is going to have real serious and lasting consequences.
Right. Can we talk a little bit about that information, the sort of dispersal of information streams? And I don't know, Sharon, if you have thoughts on this. That seems to be something that I certainly knew intellectually, but really only in the last few weeks have I really appreciated that people are getting information from places that have nothing to do with the old streams of information. Yes, this is an old story. We've been talking about this with the internet for a while, but Joe Rogan's podcast, NBC interviewed somebody today who was in line in Arizona to vote and said, I wasn't sure who to vote for, but then I heard Kamala Harris didn't go on Joe Rogan's podcast, so I decided to vote for Trump. This is a big issue, and nobody can agree on sort of what's true or what's authoritative, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is a big issue. And the candidates this time, at least one of the candidates, understand a little bit more about the diversified media ecosystem and actually did a lot to try to reach out to that sort of diversified media ecosystem. I'm speaking about Harris right now in terms of having dedicated influencer rooms at the DNC, having individuals that they would reach out to and bring in and be able to, have access to top level officials. So I do think that there's beginning to be this sort of understanding of the shifting landscape of where people are getting their information from. And when it comes to the Trump side of things, there certainly are plenty of right-wing media personalities. And they exist in a slightly different sphere than these other sort of people who like the Harris campaign has worked with. But nevertheless, the difference between the right-wing sort of media ecosystem is that all of them nearly fall in line with Trump talking points, what Trump wants them to say. And there's this sort of like get in line behind Trump because the Trump is the golden ticket. If we're saying the things that he likes, he'll promote us. We'll get the views. Some of the sort of right-wing media ecosystem is making $10 to $20 million a year on YouTube and on brand deals and on their premium podcasts, etc.
And on funding from the Russians, but that's
it's truly an astonishing amount of money that is there to be made, sort of in the right-wing media ecosystem. And even though Harris has done more to reach out to that diversified media ecosystem, you still are not seeing this sort of left-wing structural ecosystem having been constructed. Now, there are a few people who have sort of managed to break through, but nobody on the magnitude of, say, a Tucker Carlson or a Joe Rogan or, say, a Candace Owens. The infrastructure just doesn't exist in the same way as it does on the right wing.
And look what Harris did on her last weekend. She went to NBC's Saturday Night Live, a show that is 50 years old on TV. That's so old. That's so yesteryear.
And didn't do Joe Rogan. That was the other thing,
not do
right?
Joe Rogan.
Like
yeah, exactly. David and Megan, before you go, any final thoughts on this moment? David, I'll go to you first.
Americans have had an extraordinarily fortunate natural history, and so there's a natural tendency to say maybe it won't be so bad. I think that is a counterproductive way to think. You have to be ready for it to be bad in order to stop it from being as bad as it might otherwise be. And I hope the people who are listening to this, who span a range of points of view, don't get defeated, but also don't succumb to the belief that because it's inconvenient and unpleasant to imagine that something could be really bad, that therefore it's not really bad because it's really bad.
I would say that I'm worried that there's a lot of things that are really bad. I am disturbed that we failed to hold the norm that you concede elections that you lose. That said, I think that the last time Trump was elected, I watched my profession, a lot of other people in the kind of blue, the indigo blob, as Nate Silver calls it, decide that what had to happen was that we needed to go all in on being the resistance. We needed to anathematize him. The last thing we could do was normalize Trump. And I don't want to normalize many of the terrible things he's done. But I think that going and like leaping on every tiny thing that he did, trying to shame his voters, writing all these think pieces about how racist they all are, what bigots they all are, about how that's really what motivates them, I think it backfired. I think that strategy of trying to shame people out of voting for Trump failed. I think that it never had high prospects of success, precisely because by this point we were only talking to other people who already agreed with us. Also, people don't like to be shamed and they react really badly to it. And so I think that while I agree that going forward, we really need to think about how do we build up our institutions and make them hold against what Trump will undoubtedly try to do to them. I will say that what we tried last time definitely didn't work. And so let's try to think about a more productive and, if I may say, less condescending approach to dealing with it. Not because like I am not against all of the stuff he's done, but because I think objectively it failed. And so let's think about, is there a different and more positive approach that does not attempt to shame people out of voting for Trump or try to shame Donald Trump, who has none, and instead think about, are there other approaches that might convince people about the importance of preserving the institutions that he is definitely going to challenge?
All right. Megan McCardle, David Frum, Sharon McMahon, thank you so much for joining us, spending some time. We really appreciate it. Jamie, you're going to stick around with me, and we're going to bring in two folks here from the R Street Institute, Shoshana Weissman and Matt Germer. Shoshana, great to see you. I haven't seen you in so long, old friend, and Matt Germer as well. And then our old friend and colleague Kevin Williamson is back for us to talk about what policy might come out of what we think is likely a new Trump administration, Senate Republicans in charge, maybe the House goes Democratic, maybe. Will any of this matter in terms of policy? I know you guys are going to give us some kind of positive story here on this, but I'm going to press you to explain why we should believe it.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to go first if that helps. And I appreciate all the work that y'all have done already tonight with this live stream. I know we're 2.5 hours in. I've enjoyed all 2.5 hours of it as a regular Dispatch listener and subscriber. I think something to keep in mind as we head into what looks like it might become a Republican trifecta. I think we should note at this point that it's not clear how exactly Congress will shake out and the extent to which any party in the House might have a majority. And as has been brought up earlier on this conversation, whether any kind of majority would actually be workable, and you'd have the votes needed to get anything done. But we can looking forward, we can anticipate a handful of fights that we're always having, right? Like we're going to have to pass some sort of budget or budget reconciliation. We know that we've got fights coming up in around the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the TCJA, that was passed last time Trump was president. And Paul Ryan led that through the Congress last time. And, we have some particular individual tax provisions set to expire. And both parties have strong incentives to come back to the table and work through that in the next Congress. And so as we figure out exactly what the majorities look like, I think it's already clear that there are a handful of issues on the table that are going to have to get worked out one way or the other. The way that the majorities resolve themselves may dictate how those conversations go.
Well, it struck me that maybe the thing that Kamala Harris is going to regret the most in the Democratic Party is her suggestion that they would have gotten rid of the filibuster for a national abortion legislation. Trump wanted to do that last time around. A lot of the people that fought against it in the Senate are gone on the Republican side. I'm sure they're going to use the fact that the Democrats said they were going to do it for one issue to do it for several issues. My question to you is, where do you think that might come into play, and what policies might result from that?
I think it's a good question. And my sense, it's really more of a hunch at this point. And again, it gets back to the necessary, the question around the size of the workable majorities. But looking at the Republican conference in the Senate, I don't quite see yet sufficient support to get rid of the filibuster for policy arguments yet. There are still enough kind of McConnell strain Republicans left in the Senate that would need to be put into a position where they really didn't feel like they had any other choice. And right now, I'm not seeing that. That said, if we see some sort of mood shift in our public around, breaking news as it comes forward, we've seen in the past as Congress kind of behaves wildly in response to that kind of breaking news. That could happen, but I'll be honest, I'm skeptical that it's going to move in that direction.
Shoshana, where do you think in reconciliation? I mean, if they're not going to get rid of the filibuster, certainly they're going to use reconciliation to move legislation. What does that mean? What does it mean for the IRS? I mean, that was one of the big things last time. They expanded the IRS. Is that gone? Is the tax policy of the Trump administration going to be extended? What happens? What are they going to move through reconciliation if Republicans control the White House and the Senate?
There's a lot of policy that I think people are underestimating that's going to kind of stay the same. And one of those is tech policy. I do a lot on tech policy in general, and both sides are pretty much on the same page, even if for different reasons there. And I often disagree with them, but I think you're going to see a lot of the continuation of some stuff that the Trump administration hasn't, or not the Trump administration, I guess the Trump campaign and some of his allies haven't always liked, but a lot of Republican senators do like. There's a lot of stuff they can get through like that. But even in one party rule, you really just tend to see elected officials not be as strong as they could. They always want the plausible deniability. They always want the deference to agencies. I know it's a little harder under Chevron now, but or under the lack of Chevron now. But you kind of see them not wanting the accountability there. So I think you're going to see the same kind of tech policy bills like COSA and others come up. One thing that you're going to see really different, though, is I think I don't know who Trump would pick for FTC chairhead, but it's going to be a lot different than Lena Khan. Republicans have been a lot more protective of AI than Democrats in general. They seem to understand the competitive nature of it with regards to China a little bit more. So I think you're going to see more legislation that protects AI rather than goes after it, and an FTC that's not going after tech companies for the same reasons in the same ways. But I mean, we see unified party rule from time to time, and even when we do, we just don't see the kind of stuff they promise, like their brave, grand, free market healthcare plan that everyone united behind never happened. And if that didn't happen, I think there's a lot else that won't happen.
Do you expect Elon Musk to be a big player in tech policy, given his recent prominence in the campaign and in Trump world?
Yeah, definitely. I don't know exactly in what ways. I'm not sure how he's going to be used. I think some of it is in a good way, because I think Elon Musk owning Twitter opened up a lot of Republicans to realizing if you put government in charge and let them punish actors as they see fit, kind of not with the First Amendment, it can cause real problems. So I think there's a benefit there, but there's also, Elon Musk has his whims to one way or the other, just like a lot of actors in Trump world. And I think you're going to see so oddities there, but maybe some benefits, because I think, just having someone on Trump's side own a major platform really changed a lot of minds. But exactly how that manifests is going to be strange, because a lot of Republicans in the Senate and in Congress still really want to go hard after all tech companies in general. But now Twitter's kind of this sacred cow where you just don't want to touch it and annoy conservatives. So it's going to be a weird dynamic. I think for the better overall, because they have to grapple with the things they like and the things they don't like with tech companies. But it's going to be a lot different than it would have been under Biden, where they just be going after tech companies for sake of doing it without any really further regard.
Shoshana, it's going to be weird is something we're probably going to be saying a lot over the next couple of weeks, months, and years. Shoshana, Matt from the R Street Institute, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate you talking about this and what we can look forward to. Thanks again. And we're going to bring in two political consultants and good buddies of ours here at the Dispatch, David Kochel and Rob Stutzman. joining us. Gentlemen, how's it going? How you feeling? Rob, I
Can't
think
hear Rob.
I
You have
saw
me?
the drink. I got you, David.
Well, I spent all night on a studio set here in Des Moines, Iowa, analyzing results here. We had 2 at-risk congressional seats that Ann Selzer, the Des Moines Register, had Dem plus 16 and Dem plus 7. Both Republicans hung on to win. Zach Nunn by a couple of points and Marionette Miller Meeks by about 1,000 votes. So, and in that same poll over the weekend that the national media talked about incessantly since Saturday night at 6 p.m., Ann Selzer had Kamala Harris leading in Iowa by 3 points. Donald Trump wins by 14, 6 points more than he did in 2020. So just a unbelievably strong night here for Republicans, but also for Trump. I think it portends, for him in Wisconsin, I can't imagine that winning Iowa by 14 means he's going to end up losing Wisconsin. Dane County is coming in underperforming for Democrats. So it's just been kind of a wild night here, watching it unfold.
You guys able to hear me now?
Yes.
So in California, I mean, the presidential, we can talk about that, but it's becoming, I think, clear that California is going to be the swing state on the House, a very good chance. And returns are early here. Early by meaning it's Tuesday, and we won't count these for a couple more weeks. But interesting mixed results. David Valadao is running strong, but Ken Calvert's running behind. But keep an eye on San Bernardino County there. Up in the north end of the San Joaquin Valley, John Duarte is losing a seat that he won by about 50 votes 2 years ago. So, the days ahead here in California, I think, are going to be what the nation watches to see if the Republicans are going to control both chambers as well as the White House.
Well, Rob, I'm in California. I live in California now. I'm actually speaking to you from Laguna Beach, and my wife just texted me that Prop 36 passed, which was the soft on crime. It seems like the public here no longer likes what they view as soft on crime bill, and kind of moving in the general direction of the country, even if on the presidential level, they're obviously not voting for Trump.
We're definitely seeing the pendulum swing when it comes to crime, when it comes to even certain economic issues. They're starting to see backlash against some of the energy issues here. Yeah, Prop 36 is going to pass in the high 60s or low 70s by the time they get done counting. And the great self-owned by Gavin Newsom out here on that is when a poll came out showing over 70% support. He said he didn't recognize his state anymore. Or maybe we don't recognize his governance anymore. So California is going through an interesting time. The way the districts are drawn, it's really hard for Republicans out here to really pick up seats. It's impressive they've actually held as many House seats as they have. But Garvey tonight, Steve Garvey is running for Senate against Adam Schiff. He'll outpoll Trump probably by 3 to 4 points in California by the end of the day.
All right, so we've got. I think we should go back to David here and deal with the Ann Selzer poll here, because
David would like that.
I'm ready to dance.
I know he would. Because yes, it sent a shockwave through political media. I was on my way to Michigan to cover the final days of the campaign, and it was. I was stunned when I saw it, and it was just wrong. And we should be fair to Ann Selzer. Like she has a very good reputation for being, for having her system or her process and being sort of transparent about it. What was so wrong? What were? I guess that's sort of a two-part question. Why did she get this wrong? And why was it that the national political media was so eager to pump this up and say it was telling a story that ended up being false?
I mean, the latter is pretty easy. The
national media likes good news for Democrats, and that was pretty evident. They jumped all over it. She has a very different methodology. It's minimalist. She doesn't set any quotas. She does very little weighting. She doesn't make any predictions about what the electorate is going to look like. She lets the poll tell her what the electorate is going to look like. And in a time when a lot of Republicans, particularly rural Republicans, just don't trust the media, don't trust polling, don't trust these institutions, they don't talk to her. So she's heavily oversampling college educated. When she gets a Republican, they tend to be college educated, which means they tend to be a little bit less for Donald Trump because of the big education divide that we have, in our politics right now. The real problem here is that she decided to actually publish that poll. She published these two congressional numbers in particular that the Democrats were all excited about, with I think a 7 or 8% margin of error, and these are 200 and something person samples. So she didn't even get in the ballpark. She had the 1 + 16. It was irresponsible in my mind to publish those two polls. First of all, she didn't even put the candidate names to them. They've been doing this the last few cycles, where she'll take a statewide sample of about 800 voters, and then she asks a single congressional generic ballot question, and then she just presumes that that's the poll, even though you've had millions of dollars being spent by Lennon Bacom and Zach Nunn in District 3. She just asks, are you going to be for the Democrat, or are you going to be for the Republican? It's a silly way to do a poll. It makes no sense. She shouldn't have published that. The Register should be, I'm going to call the editor-in-chief tomorrow and just say, don't do that again, because it's ridiculous. You look bad. Everybody looks bad. Also, as I pointed out on Twitter over the weekend, there was tons of private polling going on in Iowa, just tons of it. NRCC's polling, D-Trip's polling, everybody is polling. You got all kinds of outside groups in here, and it was consistent with none of the numbers. And I know we see a lot of poll herding where everybody just tries to kind of have the same polls. Nobody wants to really be an outlier. She kind of leans into the outlier label because she's made some right calls. I don't think she's going to be able to make correct calls with the methodology she has anymore, just because these institutions have been so undermined for so long by Donald Trump and by a lot of other folks, that it's just going to get really hard to do this kind of naked test that she does, where she doesn't have any, she doesn't she doesn't put her thumb on any scale when trying to figure out what the electorate is, even though we had 50 other public polls that were screaming that, these races are going to be close and Trump has a substantial lead. So, she's going to have to go back to the drawing board on this methodology, I think.
Well, I'm sorry you don't have any strong opinions on this poll, David. Let's zoom out a little bit. Big picture, is it possible to? I don't want to crap on polls too much, because the polls seem to be generally right in that it's close. But you raise a good point here, David, which is rural Republicans don't trust the media. They don't trust institutions as much as they used to, or certainly as much as other groups do. Is it really ever possible anymore to get a good read on the electorate, whether through polls or just as mere journalists, to try to figure out what is going on? Both of you guys, Rob, David, what do we do?
I think it's a good night for the polling. The polls pretty much called all this in margin of error. The models, there's public models from the Nates, that we look at. They more or less have, they were leaning this way. Private models that Kochel and I see that campaigns run on have been pretty accurate in predicting this now for some time that would happen tonight. So, we'll let experts kind of, clear the dust off all this once all the results are in. But I think it's a good night for polling. Hopefully it breeds some confidence going forward, aside from the Iowa poll, which Kochel has an opinion about.
Do you guys know who Jeff Kaufman is, the state party chair in Iowa?
Yes.
He's got a nice little meme tonight. I mean, he's got a strong opinion too. We're all on the same page with this poll. I think it's ridiculous to publish something that looks that far off from what everybody knew was coming.
Well, that was one very, very bad poll. But polls in general, as we've been talking about, have been getting sort of a bad reputation, particularly in certain sets of the political culture. And I wonder if this is just a problem of trying to explain to people what it is polls are there to do and how they work.
Yeah.
That when you have a very close election like this one, that the margin of error in the poll is going to be greater than the margin by which the race is decided. So it's like trying to measure. If you got to measure something to the 100th of an inch, but all you have is a yardstick marked in inches, and then you're measuring in your town, and your friend 500 miles away is measuring it, and you're calling each other on the phone and trying to compare measurements and figuring out to the 100th of an inch without a tool to do it. And so I wonder if it's possible to maybe help people to explain how polls work and what they're actually supposed to do. And is there maybe a better way to talk about it, or even a better way to poll, that would make these a more useful instrument rather than this kind of Vegas bookie odds attitude we take toward them?
Well, the media could go a long way. Nothing drives me crazier than the blaring headline of candidate X leads so and so, well, by 1 point or 2 points, and instead of explaining without the sensationalism that this poll is saying, what you're suggesting, Kevin, is that the difference here could be outside the margin of error, and we're basically statistically tied, and quit treating it like a horse race. In the age of internet clicks, I suppose that is not likely to happen.
Well, I think the problem is we people think about polls as aggregates rather than as probabilities. So when you see a 51 to 49 poll, they think this person has 51% support among voters, not a 51% chance of being ahead or of winning the race. So these are slightly different things. And people, I think, so if they see a poll move, like it goes from 53% to 49%, they think, well, he can't have lost 4% of the vote overnight. It's people don't understand what the tool actually is for. I think.
Look, I think we could cut out 90% of the media coverage of horse race polling. It's ridiculous. That's not what Rob and I use polls for. We use polls to find out how to talk to voters, to find out what they want to hear, what they respond to, what they listen to, what they say back to us. So we've got this huge industry now popping up of just everybody saying, well, here, it moved in a half an inch here and a half. It's ridiculous. I don't know why we spend all of this mind share and so much time. I mean, just this one Iowa poll it got hours and hours of cable news coverage and social media coverage and retweets and back and forth. It's not what polling is supposed to do. That's not what the professionals in the industry like Rob and I use them for. We use them to help our candidates position themselves in a marketplace. I just think it's kind of an indictment of the media obsession and giving them something absolutely meaningless to talk about. And it also creates a ton of anxiety for voters, and it is very clickbaity. I wish we could sit down and really have a much deeper conversation about what they're for. I mean, at the Dispatch, you're not a horse race institution. You're trying to deliver news every day. How about the rest of media follows the Dispatch kind of down that path and maybe has more intelligent conversations about what's really moving people, what's moving things, what types of messages are out there in the marketplace, attracting people, turning people away. It's just, to me, the whole thing is kind of broken, and the Seltzer poll is a place for me to just jump off from. And
I hate to disagree with you, but I don't really want to encourage that, because we'd like to try to keep the market for good, responsible journalism to ourselves as much as.
But I do follow the Dispatch. Slap that on a bumper sticker. That sounds good. Real quick, I didn't want to have a whole discussion on polls. So in 30 seconds, Rob, give us sort of your big picture. what does this really mean on the presidential level to see Trump appear to really dominate and maybe get an even bigger EC victory than he did 8 years ago?
I mean, I think what it means to our politics is Democrats better figure out how to compete against this Republican Party. He's continuing to pull voters out of their traditional coalition, and he's doing it with, in my view, terrible ideas. And it'll be fascinating if we get the Trump tariffs that he's claiming are going to come. Are the Democrats going to see an opportunity to be able to, organize against that? So it's really time for the Democrat Party to pivot, I think, in our presidential politics. I've more or less concluded as a Republican that hasn't voted for Trump in 3 cycles that this isn't going to come back in primaries. It's got to come back either through third-party competition or the Democrats trying to actually extend themselves to a majority coalition, which means the center.
Yep. Yeah. All right. Well, Rob, David, thanks so much for joining us here near the end of our live stream. We really appreciate it. Jamie and Kevin, stick around because we're going to close things out, hopefully, here with our reporters in the field. David Drucker is in West Palm Beach. Charles Hillu we're waiting for him to log on, but he is here in Washington, D.C. at the Kamala Harris campaign headquarters. Drucker, give us a sense. What is it like? Is it are people ebullient down in West Palm Beach as Donald Trump is
ebullient's a good word. It's a good word. People are happy. They've been happy all night. They really, Mike, you and I have discussed this. Republicans have been very confident that Donald Trump was going to overperform the polling as they saw it, even though I've been listening in, and I don't think the polls miss. There's a margin of error. It's larger than people realize when you look at the math about how it works. But this night really worked out for Trump, I think, in a way that they were all expecting. Now, I spoke earlier tonight to Hogan Gidley, who's a former White House press secretary for Trump, and he stayed within that circle. And he was a little bit more cautious in understanding how vote dumps come from this county and that county and election day and early vote. And so, he wanted to stay within the realm of understanding how this stuff works. But what he was telling me is that their effort to go after low propensity voters, they believe worked. They don't believe they simply cannibalized their election day vote by pushing their voters to early vote. And so they just felt good all the way around. And Trump is expected here momentarily where he will address the crowd. It seems pretty clear from everything we've seen that he is going to win. And so I expect his remarks to reflect that. And these people are just simply very, very happy. And, what we have now is a reverse of what happened 4 years ago when it was the other side that was happy and it was this group that was despondent. But there's going to be a lot to unpack with this race and how this went down and what comes next.
My mic is muted. I'm sorry. Charles, you're here. You're at Howard University in Washington. I hope you can hear us. Kamala Harris is not going to be speaking tonight. What was the mood like at Harris HQ in DC?
I will say for a moment that the mood, if you were to look earlier in the night around probably 9 or 10 p.m., as we were getting those first results in from the battleground states of North Carolina and Georgia, it was almost like a different world from the broader discourse, on Twitter and kind of everywhere else. You would see that things were leaning toward Trump, but people were actually pretty joyful here. It's a term we've used a lot for the Harris campaign. That was the general admission section, at least. But then on the other side of the press section was the VIP section, and the VIPs actually had to kind of walk through the press section in order to get to their assigned seating. And I could see them, and their faces. I mean, there were very few people smiling. They looked glum. They looked like they knew what was going on. And then shortly after, I noticed that the CNN broadcast came on, and they called a state for Harris, but then Afterwards, it was basically just a bunch of bad news for the Democrats. Trump was leading in these battleground states, and then the crowd seemed to have reality set in. And as the temperature out here at night grew colder, so did the crowd's mood. They were there was less. They were line dancing at the very beginning. They were playing songs like "All Right" by Kendrick Lamar. That was not to be found once that sort of stuff happened. And then they also had Abby Phillip, who was reporting from Howard University. She actually reported on this memo from Jen O'Malley Dillon, who's the Biden campaign, or excuse me, the Harris campaign manager. And she said that basically their path to victory goes through the blue wall. And she also said that they were going to continue the fight into tomorrow, and that it's more likely we'll get a result tomorrow, which is true officially, but we kind of have a sense of where the wind is blowing. And after that, people were sad. There was where there were smiles, there were either frowns or just straight faces. And then shortly thereafter, North Carolina was called for Trump. And then after that, Cedric Richmond, who's a senior official on I keep saying Biden, on the Harris campaign, he came out and announced to the crowd that Harris would not be speaking. And then people filed out pretty quickly after that. Richmond said that Harris would be coming here tomorrow to speak. But people came. One point I actually saw.
Hey Charles, you're starting to break up a little bit. So I think we got an understanding of how morose everyone was at Howard.
Yes.
So all right, well, great. Well, it's good to hear. Look, we're at the end here of our live stream. Really appreciate David and Charles for their reporting. Jamie and then Kevin, any final thoughts before we sign off for the night on this kind of remarkable election night?
Well, I mean, I guess looking at the two campaigns here, I guess Lee Greenwood in one way beat Taylor Swift and Beyonce, and we are going to go back to a news cycle that is 5 p.m. every night. When the reporters think they're finishing up, they're going to get a tweet and change things completely. It's going to be a very different news cycle than we experienced the last 4 years, for better or worse. Just a remarkable night with a likely remarkable result of a comeback that many people didn't expect.
Kevin?
Lee Greenwood, huh? Yeah, Jamie manages to put it in the terms that will most annoy me. So thanks for one of the mistakes I made tonight was coming to the Republican watch party instead of the Democratic watch party. I always prefer to be where they're losing because I don't like enthusiasm in politics, and to be around enthusiasm just makes me feel a little bit creeped out. I think that this will be told as a remarkable story in our political history. I often debate with myself and other people whether we actually live in politically significant times, and I often think that we don't. And I think that if you had asked me at the end of the last Trump administration what people would say about it in the future, I would say that we elected a reality television show game show host, and that was kind of weird. And it was this incursion of celebrity into the world of politics. And then there was this attempt to hold on to power at the end, and that's all would ever be said about it. But now there's going to be another chapter to that story and this kind of remarkable comeback. People will do a lot of things to stay out of jail, and apparently get yourself elected president is one way to maybe try to do that. So it's going to be very, very strange times. I worry a little bit that our friends on the left who have been so sanctimonious about Republican populists and January 6th and all that stuff are going to be really, really hard to live with for the next couple of weeks. There may be some violence. There may be some protests that turn into riots and that sort of thing. I hate to forecast that kind of thing, but I think it's certainly something to keep an eye out for and to worry about and lament and maybe try to prevent before it happens if it's at all possible to do so. And it's good to remind people that the country is the country; it's not the president, and that it goes on one way or the other.
Well, we certainly hope so. I want to remind people that anybody listening tonight who was not a dispatch member, if you like what you heard, all the folks that spoke to us gave us their analysis and their reporting. If you like all of that, you're not a member, head to thedispatch.com/join and become a dispatch member. We've got so many great offerings, and there'll be a lot of need for it, from Kevin's Wonderland newsletter to Jamie's Monday podcast, interview podcast. We've got a number of newsletters, articles. You got to become a member. So join us at thedispatch.com/join. Thank you on behalf of Jamie and Kevin and Drucker and everybody else who joined us. Thanks so much for sticking with us on this election night. Check out Dispatch Politics in the Morning Dispatch tomorrow. And everybody's waving behind me. We'll see you next time.